Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a silence between the stars that most beings never hear. Not the quiet of empty rooms or abandoned cities, but something far older and far more patient. It is the silence of the predator waiting in the tall grass. The silence of the deep ocean trench where light has never reached and pressure crushes all things into shapes unrecognizable to surface dwellers. It is the silence that existed before language, before thought, before the first stirring of consciousness in the primordial soup of a billion forgotten worlds. And if you listen closely, if you press your ear to the cold hull of a void ship drifting on the edge of known space, you might hear something within that silence. Not a sound, exactly. More like the absence of sound becoming aware of itself. A hunger so vast and so ancient that it has become indistinguishable from the darkness between galaxies. That is the Tyranids. Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we are going to go somewhere dark and deep and terribly, terribly cold. We are going to talk about the Great Devourer, the swarm without end, the biological nightmare that has crossed the impossible distances between galaxies to feast upon everything our Milky Way has to offer. But more than just telling you what the Tyranids are, tonight I want to explore something far more unsettling. I want to talk about what they are preparing for. Because the more you dig into the lore, the more you study the patterns of their invasions, the stranger things the hive fleets have been doing, and the quiet dread that seeps through every report and every encounter, the more you begin to realize that what we have seen so far might only be the opening moves of something we cannot begin to comprehend. Think about that for a moment. The galaxy of the 41st and 42nd millennia is already drowning in war. The Imperium of man, that decaying colossus of 10,000 years of human civilization, can barely hold itself together against the horrors that press in from every direction. Chaos pours through the great rift like an infected wound splitting open across the sky. The Necrons stir from their tombs beneath a million worlds, ancient and terrible and hungry for dominion. The Orcs rampage across entire sectors in great tides of violence and joyful destruction. The Aeldari fight their slow and elegant war against extinction, while the Toe push ever outward with their naive optimism and their pulse rifles. And through it all, creeping in from the edges, from the cold, black nothing beyond the galactic rim, come the Tyranids, patient, relentless, utterly without mercy, and the truly terrifying part. According to every analysis, every strategic projection, every desperate calculation made by the brightest minds in the Imperium service, what the galaxy has faced so far from the Tyranid hive fleets is merely the tip of a biological iceberg, so vast that the full scale of it would drive a lesser mind to madness. The battles that have been fought, the worlds that have been consumed, the trillions that have died screaming beneath chitinous claws and bioacid, all of it amounts to little more than the first tentative taste of something that has been feeding on galaxies since before humanity's ancestors crawled from the oceans of old Earth. So, settle in, get comfortable, because this is going to be a long journey into the belly of the beast. We are going to trace the Tyranids from their mysterious origins in the void between galaxies, through the wars they have waged and the worlds they have devoured, past the strange and troubling things they are building in the darkness, and all the way to the edge of speculation about what their ultimate purpose might be. And I promise you, by the end of it, you will never look at the stars the same way again. Let us begin with the most fundamental question of all. Where did the Tyranids come from? And what drove them to cross the unimaginable emptiness between galaxies to reach our own? The answer to the first question is deceptively simple. Nobody knows. Not truly, not with any certainty. The Tyranids are extragalactic in origin, meaning they come from somewhere beyond the borders of the Milky Way. That alone should give you pause. The Milky Way galaxy is roughly 100,000 light-years across. It contains somewhere between 100 billion and 400 billion stars, the distances involved are so vast that even with warp travel, crossing from one side to the other is a journey measured in years or decades. And the Tyranids have come from beyond even that. They have traversed the intergalactic void, that colossal emptiness between galaxies where there are no stars, no worlds, no warmth, nothing but cold radiation and the faintest whisper of cosmic background noise left over from the birth of the universe itself. The distances between galaxies make the distances within them look like the space between your front door and your mailbox. The nearest major galaxy to our own, Andromeda, sits roughly 2.5 million light-years away. Even the smaller satellite galaxies that orbit the Milky Way are tens of thousands of light-years beyond its rim. And the Tyranids crossed that void. In the dark, in the cold, for millennia upon millennia, drifting through absolute nothing with a patience that makes the stones of ancient mountains seem hasty and impulsive. Some Imperial scholars believe the Tyranids may have consumed 1,000 galaxies before turning their attention to ours. 1,000 galaxies. The number is so absurdly large that it barely registers as meaningful to a human mind. If true, it would mean that the Tyranids have annihilated millions upon millions of intelligent species across a span of time that dwarfs the entire history of the Milky Way's civilizations. Every alien empire that ever rose and fell in those devoured galaxies, every culture that ever produced art or music or philosophy, every species that ever looked up at its own alien stars and wondered what lay beyond them, all of it reduced to raw biological material to feed the endless hunger of the swarm. Now, the lore does give us one very important piece of the puzzle regarding how the Tyranids found our galaxy specifically. During the Horus Heresy, that cataclysmic civil war that tore the Imperium apart roughly 10,000 years before the current setting, there was a device called the Pharos. The Pharos was a piece of ancient technology, later determined to be of Necron origin, that functioned as a kind of psychic lighthouse. It harnessed empathic energy to aid in navigation through the warp, similar to the Astronomicon, but on a smaller scale. Primarch Robute Guilliman of the Ultramarines used the Pharos as a beacon to rally scattered loyalist forces to his domain of Ultramar during the chaos of the heresy. The critical moment came during the Battle of Sotha, when a loyalist Iron Warriors warsmith named Barabbas Dantioch overloaded the Pharos device to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Night Lord's traitors. The overload worked as a weapon, scattering the traitor fleet, but it had an unintended consequence that would prove far more devastating than anything the heresy itself produced. But the sudden burst of psychic energy from the device shot outward across space and time, piercing the intergalactic void like a flare fired into the deepest, darkest night. And somewhere out there, in the cold emptiness between galaxies, something noticed. The epilogue of the novel Pharos by Guy Haley describes this moment from the perspective of the entities that detected the signal. Though they are not named, they are unmistakably Tyranid, a fleet of biological vessels drifting in a state of dormancy, their sensor organisms reflexively registering the psychic pulse. Slowly, other entities are brought awake to examine the signal, and then, with a terrible deliberation, the fleet adopts a new heading, toward the Milky Way, toward us. It took them roughly 10,000 years to arrive, 10,000 years of drifting through the void, as drawn by the memory of that psychic flare and perhaps by the continuous glow of the Astronomicon itself, that blazing psychic beacon generated by the Emperor of Mankind from his golden throne on Terra, which serves as a lighthouse for Imperial navigation, but also, as it turns out, serves as a dinner bell for things in the dark. The Tyranids do not travel through the warp as most species do. Instead, they use gravity manipulation to propel their hive ships through real space at faster than light speeds. It is slower than warp travel, far slower, but it is also infinitely more reliable and requires no interaction with the hellish dimension of chaos. This method of travel suggests that the Tyranids are creatures of the material universe, not some manifestation of the warp or another dimension, but something that evolved or was created in the same physical reality that the rest of us inhabit. And that, in many ways, makes them more frightening than anything the warp has ever produced. Demons can be banished. Chaos can be resisted through faith and will. But the Tyranids are as real and as material as the ground beneath your feet, and their hunger is not driven by malice or corruption or any emotion that a human being could understand and combat. It is simply what they are. They consume because consuming is their nature, the same way fire burns and water flows downhill, and gravity pulls all things toward the center of mass. When the first Tyranid hive fleet finally reached the galaxy in 745 of the 41st Millennium, it struck the eastern fringe of Imperial space with a violence that beggared description. The planet Tyran, and a minor research outpost of the Adeptus Mechanicus, was the first to fall. It was from this doomed world that the Tyranids received the name by which the Imperium knows them, for it was Inquisitor Cryptman of the Ordo Xenos who discovered the devastated remains of Tyran and realized what had done this. What he found was a world stripped of all life, all moisture, all atmosphere, a dead rock floating in the void where a living world had once been. And the recordings left behind by the defenders, the fragmentary pict captures, and increasingly desperate Vox transmissions, painted a picture of something that no human military doctrine had ever been designed to face. This was not an invasion in any conventional sense. This was predation on a planetary scale, and it was only the beginning. But here is what I want you to hold in your mind as we continue deeper into this subject. The first hive fleet to reach the galaxy, Behemoth, was destroyed. The second, Kraken, was shattered. The third, Leviathan, the largest yet encountered, has been slowed and diverted, but never truly stopped. And through it all, through every battle and every victory and every desperate last stand, the defenders of the galaxy have been fighting what amounts to the forward scouts of something immeasurably larger. The main body of the Tyranid swarm is still out there in the void, still approaching. And with each fleet that arrives, the hive mind learns more about what awaits it here. It adapts, it evolves, it becomes better at killing and consuming with every engagement. The galaxy is not fighting a war against the Tyranids, it is being tested by them, probed, measured, and whatever the hive mind concludes from these tests will determine what comes next. That thought alone should be enough to keep the most hardened veteran of the Astra Militarum awake at night, staring at the ceiling of their barracks and wondering if tomorrow will be the day the sky turns dark with spores and the ground begins to shake with the footfalls of something that has eaten stars. So let us look deeper. Let us examine the intelligence behind the swarm, the vast and terrible mind that coordinates trillions of organisms across the breadth of the galaxy with the precision of a single thought. The hive mind is not something that can be easily described in human terms, because it is not a human thing. It is not even close to human. It is not a brain sitting in a skull somewhere, thinking thoughts and making decisions the way you or I might. It is not an artificial intelligence running calculations on some biological supercomputer. It is something far stranger and far more alien than either of those concepts, and the very few individuals who have ever touched its consciousness have come away either dead, insane, or profoundly changed in ways that no medicine or prayer can reverse. The hive mind is the Gestalt collective consciousness of the entire Tyranid species. Every single Tyranid organism in existence, from the smallest ripper swarm to the most massive hive ship drifting through the void, contributes its psychic energy to this vast pool of awareness. The result is not simply the sum of its parts. It is something exponentially greater, as a consciousness of such staggering complexity and power that it has been compared to the chaos gods themselves in terms of its sheer psychic magnitude. And unlike the chaos gods, who are capricious and driven by emotion and desire, The hive mind appears to possess only one driving imperative: consume, expand, survive, evolve. It does not hate its prey. It does not enjoy their suffering. It does not revel in destruction the way corn does, or find pleasure in decay like Nurgle. The hive mind simply does not care about its prey in any emotional sense whatsoever. You are biomass. Your cities are biomass. Your hopes and dreams and loves and fears are irrelevant biochemical processes occurring in biomass that has not yet been processed. The hive mind registers you the same way you might register a sandwich. It is aware that you exist. While it knows that you contain nutrients, it will consume you when it is efficient to do so. Beyond that, you do not matter. This is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Tyranid threat. There is nothing to reason with, nothing to appeal to, no common ground upon which negotiation might take place. The Toe, with their characteristic optimism, actually attempted diplomatic contact with the Tyranids during the early encounters with Hive Fleet Gorgon. They sent emissaries, transmitted messages of peace and mutual benefit on every frequency they could manage. The response was a wave of gargoyles and hormagaunts that ripped the diplomatic vessel apart and consumed its crew down to the last molecule of protein. The Tau learned their lesson, though it cost them dearly in blood and biomass. The way the hive mind exerts control over its swarms is through a hierarchical psychic network centered on what are called synapse creatures. These are the larger, more intelligent Tyranid organisms, such as hive tyrants, Tyranid warriors, zoanthropes, and others that serve as psychic relay nodes for the hive mind's will. When you imagine the hive mind as a brain, these synapse creatures are its neurons, transmitting orders and coordinating actions across the battlefield with a speed and precision that makes even the most disciplined human military look sluggish by comparison. Through synapse, the hive mind can direct millions of lesser organisms with absolute authority, orchestrating attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, adapting tactics in real time to counter enemy strategies, and sacrificing individual organisms without hesitation whenever doing so serves the greater goal of consumption. The lesser Tyranid bioforms, things like termagants and hormagaunts and gargoyles, do not truly think for themselves. They possess basic animal instincts, enough to feed and defend themselves, but without the guiding influence of synapse creatures, they revert to feral behavior. They become simple predators, dangerous but unfocused, attacking whatever is nearest rather than coordinating their efforts. This is why killing synapse creatures is one of the few effective anti-Tyranid tactics available to the defenders of the galaxy. Remove the relay nodes, and the swarm falls into temporary disarray. But the hive mind is aware of this weakness, of course. It always is. It has adapted by deploying synapse creatures in overlapping patterns that create redundancy in the network, ensuring that the loss of any single node does not cripple the swarm. It has also developed more advanced synapse organisms, like the Norn emissaries, massive creatures that serve as direct conduits for the hive mind's will on the battlefield, and whose psychic presence is so powerful that even the death of surrounding synapse creatures cannot disrupt their control. And then there is the phenomenon known as the shadow in the warp. This is perhaps the most strategically devastating weapon in the Tyranid arsenal, and it requires no claws, no teeth, no bioweapons of any kind. It is simply the side effect of the hive mind's immense psychic presence. As a hive fleet approaches a target system, as the sheer weight of its collective consciousness distorts the warp for light years in every direction. Imperial astropaths cannot send or receive telepathic messages. Navigators cannot guide ships through the warp. Psychic communication, the lifeline that holds the Imperium together across the vast distances of space, simply ceases to function. The target world is cut off, isolated, alone. No reinforcements can be called. No warnings can be sent. The planet simply goes silent, and by the time anyone notices the silence and investigates its cause, it is usually far too late. But the shadow in the warp does more than just block communication. It penetrates into the minds of nearby creatures and manifests as a primal, creeping dread that cannot be shaken or rationalized away. Normal humans feel an inexplicable unease, a growing horror that something terrible is approaching. Psychers, those individuals who possess a connection to the warp and can wield its energies, fare far worse. The shadow in the warp is agony to them, a psychic scream of such alien power that it can drive even trained and disciplined psychers into incurable madness. Whole populations have plunged into despair and lunacy before the first Tyranid organism ever set foot on their world, the shadow in the warp breaking their minds before the swarm breaks their bodies. Almost every attempt by a psyker to make direct contact with the hive mind has ended in death or insanity. The consciousness is simply too vast, too alien, too fundamentally incomprehensible to a human mind. Those who have glimpsed it describe a darkness of unimaginable scale, as a hunger so deep and so total that it makes the most extreme human desires seem like passing fancies by comparison. The only known agent of the Imperium, believed to have looked upon the hive mind and retained his sanity, is Chief Librarian Tigurius of the Ultramarines, whose uncanny ability to predict Tyranid movements suggests he has indeed established some form of connection with it. How he has maintained his sanity in doing so is a mystery that even Tigurius himself may not fully understand. There is a moment in the novel, Devastation of Baal, by Guy Haley, that captures the nature of the hive mind, as well as anything in the lore. Chapter Master Dante of the Blood Angels, during the desperate defense of his homeworld against hive fleet Leviathan, looks into the eyes of the Swarmlord, the most powerful Tyranid synapse creature ever created. And through those eyes, Dante glimpses the soul of the hive mind itself. What he finds there is not hatred, not malice, not any of the emotions he has spent centuries fighting against in the servants of chaos. What he finds is hunger, pure, bottomless, cosmic hunger, and he pities it. The hunger of the hive mind makes the red thirst of his own chapter, that curse of vampiric need that has haunted the Blood Angels for 10,000 years, seem trivial by comparison. Think about what that means. A being that has lived for over 1,000 years, that has faced demons and traitors, and the worst the galaxy has to offer, looks into the heart of the Tyranid hive mind and feels pity. Not fear, though fear would certainly be justified. Pity. Because the hunger he sees there is so total, so all-consuming, so utterly without relief or satisfaction, as that it transcends horror and becomes something closer to tragedy. The hive mind does not enjoy consuming the galaxy. It does not choose to be what it is. It simply hungers, and it will hunger forever, and nothing it devours will ever be enough. This raises a question that hangs over the entire Tyranid narrative like a storm cloud. If the hive mind's hunger is truly infinite, if no amount of biomass can satisfy it, then what is the point? What is the endgame? Is the hive mind simply a cosmic accident, a biological process that has spiraled out of control across eons of time? Or is there something more deliberate behind it? Some purpose or design that the galaxy's inhabitants are only now beginning to dimly perceive? We will return to that question. But first, let us examine how the Tyranids actually go about the business of consuming a world, because the process itself reveals a great deal about what the hive mind might be building toward. The consumption of a world by a Tyranid hive fleet is not a chaotic affair. It is not the random violence of an orc rampage or the indiscriminate slaughter of a chaos incursion. It is a systematic, phased operation that proceeds with the precision of a surgical procedure, each stage building upon the last, with an efficiency that speaks to an intelligence capable of planning on a scale that most human minds cannot fathom. And it begins long, long before the first Tyranid bioform ever touches the planet's surface. The first stage is infiltration, and it can begin decades or even centuries before the hive fleet arrives. Genostealers, those sleek and deadly vanguard organisms of the swarm, are seeded onto target worlds through a variety of means. They may arrive aboard space hulks, those massive conglomerations of wrecked ships that drift through the warp, or they may be carried to their targets by infected refugees fleeing from previous Tyranid incursions. However they arrive, once even a single genestealer reaches an inhabited world, the process of corruption begins. We will discuss genestealer cults in much greater detail later, but for now, understand that they represent the hive mind's patience made manifest. The willingness to invest decades of preparation into the softening of a single target world speaks volumes about the strategic depth of the Tyranid intelligence. And the second stage begins when the hive fleet draws close enough for its shadow in the warp to fall across the target system. Communication dies. The warp routes that connect the world to the wider Imperium become impassable or dangerously unstable. Psykers begin to suffer, their powers flickering or becoming uncontrollable. The population experiences a growing sense of dread, of something vast and terrible approaching from the darkness. If a genestealer cult exists on the world, the psychic proximity of the hive fleet triggers a subliminal reaction in the cult's brood mind, driving the cultists into a frenzy of violence and insurrection. Planetary defenses that might have held against the initial assault are torn apart from within before the first spore pod falls from the sky. When the hive fleet arrives in orbit, the true horror begins. As the bioships themselves are monstrous beyond easy description, living vessels grown from organic material rather than constructed from metal and ceramite. These are not ships in the way that an Imperial battlecruiser or an Aeldari wraith ship is a ship. They are organisms, vast space-faring creatures whose bodies serve the same functions as the hull plating, weapons batteries, and engine systems of a conventional warship, but achieved through billions of years of biological refinement rather than engineering. The largest of them, the hive ships that carry the Norn queens at their hearts, are comparable in size to Imperial battleships, and they fight with weapons that are as alive as the ships themselves. Massive bioplasma batteries that vomit streams of superheated organic acid across the void, or tentacles kilometers long that can wrap around enemy vessels and crush them or drag them into the maw of the hive ship to be digested. Swarms of drone organisms that function as fighters and boarding torpedoes, crashing into enemy ships to disgorge clutches of genestealers and hormagaunts into the corridors of vessels whose crews thought they were safe behind bulkheads and void shields. The void battle is often the forgotten phase of a Tyranid invasion, overshadowed in the popular imagination by the ground war that follows. But it is in the void that the battle for a world is often decided. If the hive fleet can achieve orbital superiority, the planet below is essentially doomed, and no amount of ground resistance can save a world whose skies are darkened by bioships and whose atmosphere is being seeded with trillions of microscopic invasion organisms. The Imperial Navy has learned through bitter experience that the void engagement must be won or at least fought to a stalemate if the ground forces are to have any chance at all. But fighting Tyranid bioships is a uniquely harrowing experience for void crews. The ships do not behave like conventional warships. They do not follow predictable tactical patterns. They adapt in real time, changing their formations and attack patterns mid-battle as the hive mind processes information from the engagement and adjusts its approach. And they regenerate. Damage that would cripple or destroy a conventional warship is healed by Tyranid bioships over the course of hours or days, their living flesh knitting itself back together with a tenacity that borders on the obscene. The skies darken as clouds of mycetic spores are launched from the bioships overhead, crashing into the planet's surface and birthing terrors beyond counting. The first wave, sometimes called the Alpha Swarm, contains the genetic material of the fleet's ruling Norn Queen and serves a dual purpose. It engages the planet's defenders to test their strength and capabilities while simultaneously relaying environmental and battlefield data back to the Norn Queen in orbit. Based on this information, the Norn Queen adapts the second and subsequent generations of bioforms to counter whatever defenses the prey world has to offer. If the defenders rely on armor, the Norn Queen spawns organisms with stronger acid and more powerful anti-tank biomorphs. And if they favor fortified positions, burrowing creatures like raveners and trigons are produced to attack from below. If they have powerful psychers, specialized null organisms are deployed to neutralize psychic resistance. The adaptation is rapid, sometimes occurring within hours, and it is devastatingly effective. The ground war itself is a nightmare of scale and ferocity that defies easy description. Imagine a tide of chitin and claw and fang stretching from horizon to horizon, every creature in it moving with purpose, every organism fulfilling its designated role in the hive mind's grand design. Termagants advance in waves of hundreds of thousands, their flesh borers spitting living ammunition at the defenders. Hormagaunts leap and bound across the battlefield with horrifying speed, as their scything talons carving through armor and flesh alike. Gargoyles fill the skies in flocks so dense they blot out the sun, while carnifexes lumber through the chaos like living, battering rams, crushing fortifications beneath their massive bulk. And behind them all, coordinating every movement and every attack, the synapse creatures maintain the web of psychic control that transforms this biological avalanche into a precision instrument of conquest. The defenders fight back, of course. Humanity does not go gently into the gullet of the Great Devourer. The Astra Militarum hold their lines with lasguns and tanks, and the desperate courage of men and women who know they are fighting for the survival of their species. Space Marines drop from orbit in pods and gunships. It's their genetically enhanced bodies and centuries of training making them the most effective Tyranid killers in the Imperium's arsenal. Knights stride across the battlefield like walking cathedrals, their thermal cannons and chainswords reaping a terrible harvest among the swarm. And sometimes, against the smaller tendrils and splinter fleets, these defenses are enough. Sometimes the defenders hold, but against a full-strength hive fleet, conventional military resistance is ultimately futile. Not because the defenders lack courage or skill, but because of the mathematics of attrition. The Tyranids lose millions of organisms in the course of a planetary invasion. Millions. And it does not matter. Each organism that falls is simply recycled, its biomass absorbed back into the swarm to be reconstituted as something new. The defenders, and by contrast, cannot replace their losses. Every soldier who falls, every tank that burns, every round of ammunition expended is gone forever. The Tyranids can afford to trade 100 organisms for every defender they kill and still come out ahead, because the dead Tyranids will be eaten and reborn, while the dead defenders will simply be eaten. Once the organized resistance on a world has been broken, the consumption phase begins in earnest. Ripper swarms, those small but voracious creatures that serve as the hive mind's cleanup crew, flood across the landscape in untold billions, consuming every scrap of biological material they can find. Trees, grass, animals, corpses, anything organic is devoured and broken down into raw biomass. Simultaneously, microscopic biomorphs are released into the atmosphere, beginning the process of breaking down the planet's biosphere at the molecular level. The air itself becomes thick with floating organisms that clog lungs and corrode exposed skin, making survival for any remaining defenders virtually impossible, even in sealed environments. As the consumption progresses, vast reclamation pools form on the planet's surface, lakes of thick, nutrient-rich biological slurry created from the rendered remains of everything that once lived there. From these pools rise enormous capillary towers, organic structures that reach up into the atmosphere and connect with the hive ships in low orbit via feeding tubes resembling vast umbilical cords. The slurry is pumped upward into the waiting bioships, where the Norn queens ingest it and use the raw materials to produce new bioforms, new weapons, new ships, and new strategies for the next world on the fleet's path. Finally, the planet's oceans and atmosphere are consumed. Vast drone ship haulers descend to low orbit and begin siphoning up every useful element that remains, stripping the world down to the bedrock and beyond. When the hive fleet finally departs, what it leaves behind is nothing. Not a barren world, not a dead world, nothing. A lifeless, airless rock, stripped down to the molecular level, as empty and sterile as the void between stars. If you were to visit such a world after the Tyranids had finished with it, you would find no trace that anything had ever lived there. No fossils, no ruins, no chemical traces of organic activity, just stone and silence, and the faint, lingering echo of a billion screams that no one will ever hear. This process, all from initial infiltration to final consumption, is what the Tyranids have refined over eons of feeding across countless galaxies. It is perfection, born of practice, a machine of consumption so efficient that it leaves nothing behind and wastes nothing in the taking. And the hive mind has performed this operation not once, not 100 times, but potentially millions of times across the vast span of cosmic history. But here is what should trouble you, what should make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up and refuse to lie flat. The consumption of worlds is not the goal, it is the method. The biomass the Tyranids consume is fuel, raw material, for the production of ever more and ever better organisms. Each world consumed makes the swarm larger, stronger, more diverse in its capabilities. Or each species devoured adds its genetic secrets to the hive mind's library, potentially appearing in new bioforms generations hence. The consumption is not an end in itself. It is a means to an end that we have not yet been able to identify. The Tyranids are not just eating the galaxy, they are using the galaxy to build something. And the question of what that something might be is one that keeps inquisitors awake at night and drives magos biologists to the edges of their considerable intellects. Because whatever the hive mind is building, it has been building it for a very, very long time. And it shows no signs of being finished. Now let us trace the history of the Tyranid invasions of the Milky Way, because the pattern of these wars tells us something crucial about how the hive mind thinks and how its strategies have evolved over time. The Imperium has designated 4 major conflicts as the Tyrannic Wars, and each one has been larger, more sophisticated, and more devastating than the last. This escalation is not accidental, it is deliberate. It is the hive mind learning. The First Tyrannic War began in 745 of the 41st Millennium with the arrival of Hive Fleet Behemoth. This was the Imperium's first encounter with the Tyranid species, and it nearly ended in catastrophe. Behemoth struck the eastern fringe of the galaxy with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, driving straight through the outlying worlds of the Ultramar subsector in a direct line toward Macragge, the homeworld of the Ultramarines. The approach was almost crude by later Tyranid standards, a single massive fleet moving in a straight line. Is consuming everything in its path without regard for strategic maneuvering or deception. Behemoth destroyed the planet Tyran and several other worlds before slamming into the defenses of Macragge itself. What followed was one of the most famous battles in the history of the 41st Millennium. The Ultramarines, under the command of Chapter Master Marneus Calgar, fought a desperate defense of their homeworld that pushed them to the absolute limit of their capabilities. The fighting was savage and unrelenting, with the Tyranids throwing wave after wave of organisms against the Ultramarines' positions, with complete disregard for losses. The Swarmlord itself, that ancient and terrible bioform that serves as the hive mind's ultimate battlefield commander, led the assault on Macragge's polar fortresses, as where it matched tactics with Calgar and nearly killed him in personal combat.
Now, before we keep going, I just want to take a quick second to share something personal out here. Out of every faction in this setting, the Tyranids are the ones that genuinely unsettle me the most. And I know that sounds weird because on the surface they're just big space bugs. But the more you dig into their lore, the more you realize that they're not the only faction where diplomacy is not even a concept. You cannot negotiate, you cannot bribe them, you can't even scare them into retreating because there's no individual mind behind those eyes to feel fear in the first place. Every other enemy in 40k Even chaos has some kind of motivation you can understand on a human level. Ambition, revenge, faith, survival, whatever. The Tyranids just is just hunger. That's it. And honestly, when I was putting this script together and going through all the source material, the thing that stuck with me the most was not any single battle or campaign. It was the sheer patience of it all. The idea that this thing has been drifting toward us for millions of years, sending its cults ahead like roots growing through cracks in a foundation. And we only just now noticed. That keeps me up at night more than any Chaos God ever could. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
Calgar survived only through the sacrifice of his honor guard, who gave their lives to pull their chapter master from the Swarmlord's clutches. The battle for the polar fortresses was the crucible that broke both armies. The Ultramarines' entire veteran first company, over 100 of the chapter's most experienced warriors in their ancient Terminator armor, was annihilated to the last man in the defense. But they sold their lives at such a tremendous cost to the Swarm that Behemoth's back was broken. The Hive fleet was ultimately destroyed, its bioships shattered in orbit by the combined firepower of the Imperial Navy and the Ultramarines' own fleet. It was a victory, but a Pyrrhic one. The Ultramarines had lost their entire first company, a wound that would take decades to heal. And more importantly, the Imperium had learned a terrible lesson. The Tyranids were real. They were here, and Behemoth had been just the first fleet, the first tendril of something far, far larger. The Second Tyrannic War came in 992 of the same millennium, barely 2.5 centuries after Behemoth's destruction. This time, the threat was Hive Fleet Kraken, and it fought very differently from its predecessor. Where Behemoth had been a single massive hammer blow, Kraken divided itself into multiple tendrils that struck at different points along the eastern fringe simultaneously. This multi-pronged approach was vastly more difficult to counter, as Imperial forces were forced to split their own strength to defend against multiple threats at once. Kraken pushed deep into Imperial space, and consuming dozens of worlds and threatening major population centers across the Segmentum Ultima. The Imperium fought back on multiple fronts, winning some engagements and losing others in a confused and desperate series of running battles. The Aeldari of Craftworld Yanden were also targeted by a tendril of Kraken and came within a hair's breadth of complete destruction, saved only by the desperate intervention of their dead, as the Infinity Circuit spirits of their fallen warriors were channeled into wraith constructs to turn back the Tyranid assault. The Imperium eventually managed to blunt Kraken's advance at the Icar 4 campaign and other key engagements, but the Hive fleet was never truly destroyed. Instead, it fragmented into dozens of smaller splinter fleets that scattered across the galaxy, continuing to consume and grow in the shadows of the Imperium's attention. Some of these splinter fleets are still active, still feeding, still evolving in the dark corners of the galaxy where no one is watching. Notice the evolution between the First and Second Wars. Behemoth was a straight-line assault, powerful but predictable. Kraken was a multi-pronged invasion, adaptable and difficult to pin down. The hive mind had learned from Behemoth's defeat and adjusted its strategy accordingly. It was learning how the galaxy's defenders fought, and it was developing counters. The Third Tyrannic War began in 997 of the 41st millennium with the arrival of Hive Fleet Leviathan, and it represented a quantum leap in Tyranid strategic sophistication. Leviathan did not approach from the eastern fringe as the previous fleets had. Instead, it attacked from below the galactic plane, spearing upward into the Imperium from a direction that no one had expected. This three-dimensional thinking, attacking not just from the edges of the galaxy, but from above and below as well, demonstrated that the hive mind understood galactic geography at a level that Imperial strategists had not anticipated. Leviathan was also the largest hive fleet yet encountered, its tendrils spreading across multiple segmentums and threatening worlds that had never before seen a Tyranid. The Imperium's response was fragmented and often inadequate, with the sheer scale of the invasion overwhelming the logistical capacity of the Administratum to coordinate an effective defense. One of the most desperate measures taken during the Third Tyrannic War was the decision by Inquisitor Lord Fidus Cryptman of the Ordo Xenos to redirect a tendril of Leviathan into the Orc Empire of Octarius. Cryptman reasoned that the Orcs, with their prodigious capacity for reproduction and violence, might serve as a biological speed bump to slow Leviathan's advance. He was right, in a sense. The Octarius War that resulted became one of the most intense conflicts in the galaxy, with Orcs and Tyranids tearing each other apart in an escalating cycle of violence that produced ever larger Orc warriors and ever more deadly Tyranid bioforms. But the plan also had a terrible flaw. Whichever side eventually won the Octarius War would emerge stronger than before. The Orcs, because they grow larger and more powerful through combat. The Tyranids, or because they absorb the genetic material of everything they consume. In trying to solve one problem, Cryptman may have created an even worse one. The most famous engagement of the Third Tyrannic War was the Battle of Baal, when a tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan descended upon the homeworld of the Blood Angels. Chapter Master Dante rallied not just the Blood Angels, but nearly all of their successor chapters, assembling a force of roughly 30,000 Space Marines to defend their ancestral home. What followed was a siege of staggering scale and ferocity, with the Blood Angels fighting for their very existence against a swarm that seemed to have no end. The situation became so desperate that the Blood Angels found themselves accepting aid from unlikely quarters. The Necrons of a nearby tomb world intervened against the Tyranids, but not out of any love for humanity, but because they recognized the Hive fleet as a threat to their own plans. And in one of the most bizarre twists of the entire war, a demonic legion of Khorne, led by the bloodthirster Kabanda, descended upon the battlefield and began slaughtering Tyranids with gleeful abandon. Kabanda's motivation was not benevolence, but possessiveness. He considered the Blood Angels his prey and his enemies, and he was not about to let the Tyranids steal that rivalry from him. The arrival of the Great Rift, that vast tear in reality that split the galaxy in two, actually aided the defenders of Baal by disrupting the Tyranid advance. And ultimately, reinforcements from the Indomitus Crusade, led by the recently resurrected Primarch Reboot Guilliman himself, arrived to drive the remaining Tyranids from the system. Baal was saved, but barely, and at a cost in lives that would take generations to replace. And then came the Fourth Tyrannic War. This is the conflict that defines the current era of the setting, and it is perhaps the most alarming Tyranid invasion yet. For the first time, Hive Fleet Leviathan has struck not at the eastern fringe or the galactic south, but at the Segmentum Pacificus in the galactic west, far closer to Terra and the heart of the Imperium than any previous Hive Fleet has reached. The Hive Fleet split into three massive tendrils dubbed Nautilon, Promethor, and Grendilus by Imperial analysts, and launched a coordinated assault from above and below the galactic plane that caught the Imperium almost completely off guard. The timing was no coincidence. With the bulk of Imperial forces committed to the Indomitus Crusade and the ongoing struggle against chaos in the wake of the Great Rift, the defenses of the Segmentum Pacificus were stretched thin. The hive mind had waited. It had observed the galaxy tearing itself apart over the Great Rift and the wars of chaos, and it had chosen its moment to strike with predatory precision. The defenders of the Bastior subsector, the primary theatre of the Fourth Tyrannic War, found themselves facing a Tyranid invasion force of unprecedented size, with inadequate resources and limited reinforcement options. The Imperium's response has been to deploy elite strike forces called Soul Blades, small but powerful combined arms formations built around Space Marine corps and supplemented with Adepta Sororitas, Militarum Tempestus, Night Households, Adeptus Mechanicus elements, and even Custodes. These Soul Blades wage a guerrilla war against the Hive fleet, striking at key targets and then withdrawing before the swarm can overwhelm them. It is a strategy born of necessity rather than choice. and it speaks volumes about how dire the situation has become. The Fourth Tyrannic War also saw one of the most audacious Tyranid tactical operations ever recorded. The Hive fleet deployed multiple lictor assassins to the fortress world of Sanctum, where Lord Solar Leontus had established his command. These organisms infiltrated the world's defenses and launched a coordinated assassination attempt on Leontus himself, an operation that required not just predatory cunning, but genuine strategic planning. The attempt was only thwarted by the intervention of Trajan Valoris, as the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, who killed the lead lictor at the cost of several of his own custodians. The fact that the hive mind specifically targeted a strategic command node with precision assassin organisms demonstrates a level of military intelligence that goes far beyond simple predatory instinct. When you line up all 4 Tyrannic wars and look at them as a progression, the pattern is unmistakable and deeply unsettling. The hive mind is not simply throwing waves of organisms at the galaxy and hoping for the best. It is testing, learning, adapting, and refining its approach with each successive invasion. Behemoth tested the galaxy's defenses with brute force. Kraken tested their ability to respond to distributed threats. Leviathan tested their capacity to handle an attack from an unexpected direction. And the Fourth War tests their ability to fight when they are already stretched to the breaking point by internal conflicts. Each war is more sophisticated than the last. Each war probes a different weakness, and each war brings the Tyranids closer to the heart of the galaxy. The implication is clear, and it is terrifying. The Tyranids are not trying to conquer the galaxy through brute force. They are systematically dismantling its defenses through a process of strategic evolution that operates on a timescale that no other faction in the setting can match. They have the patience of geological processes and the adaptability of the most virulent pathogens, and every battle they fight, whether they win or lose, makes them better at fighting the next one. And now, let us talk about the single most frightening bioform the hive mind has ever produced. Not the largest, not the most heavily armed, the most frightening because of what it represents about the hive mind's capabilities and intentions. I am talking about the Swarmlord. The Swarmlord is the pinnacle of the hive tyrant bioform, a unique creature that exists at the absolute apex of Tyranid evolution. It is the hive mind's most powerful battlefield commander, its supreme general, its living embodiment of strategic genius. If a hive tyrant is to a termagant what a general is to a private, then the Swarmlord is to a hive tyrant what a god of war is to a mortal soldier. It is the most dangerous single organism the Tyranids have ever produced. But what makes the Swarmlord truly terrifying is not its formidable combat abilities. Though those are considerable, it wields 4 bone sabers that crackle with disruptive energy and can slice through adamantium and force fields as though they were tissue paper. Each saber contains a crystalline growth at its core, a mineral that is not indigenous to the Milky Way galaxy, a reminder that this creature comes from somewhere else, somewhere unimaginably distant and utterly alien. The Swarmlord can parry incoming attacks at such speed that its opponents find it nearly impossible to land a blow, and its psychic abilities allow it to coordinate Tyranid forces with a precision that borders on precognition. Number. What makes the Swarmlord truly terrifying is that it is immortal in the truest sense of the word. When the Swarmlord is killed in battle, and it has been killed many times across the millennia, its consciousness is absorbed back into the hive mind through the synaptic link, and then, when the hive mind requires it again, the Swarmlord is reborn. Not a new creature with the same designation, but the same individual, with all the memories, experiences, and tactical knowledge of its previous incarnations intact. Every battle it has ever fought, every opponent it has ever faced, every strategy it has ever employed or encountered, all of it is preserved and carried forward into the next incarnation. The Swarmlord is as old as the Tyranid race itself. It has been fighting wars since before humanity existed. It has led campaigns against civilizations that rose and fell and were consumed utterly, leaving no trace of their existence except as genetic data in the hive mind's vast biological library. The total sum of its military experience is literally beyond human comprehension, a database of warfare accumulated over millions, perhaps billions of years. No mortal general, no matter how gifted or long-lived, can hope to match that depth of experience. And here is the detail that should give you chills. The Swarmlord is only manifested when the hive mind's conventional strategies fail. It is a stress response called into being when the enemy proves too clever, too resilient, or too unpredictable for normal Tyranid tactics to overcome. This means that every time the Swarmlord appears on a battlefield, it is because the hive mind has judged the situation to be genuinely challenging. And the Swarmlord's track record in those situations is impressively good. It nearly killed Marneus Calgar on Macragge, as it directed the assault that annihilated the Ultramarines' entire First Company. It has appeared across multiple hive fleets in multiple wars, because its connection to the hive mind is so strong that it transcends the physical boundaries between different fleets. Wherever the hive mind needs its best, the Swarmlord appears. The Swarmlord also demonstrates something crucial about the nature of Tyranid evolution. The Tyranids do not evolve randomly, the way biological organisms on natural worlds do. Their evolution is directed by the hive mind, guided by an intelligence that can analyze an enemy's strengths and weaknesses and produce specific countermeasures in response. When the Imperium develops a new weapon, the hive mind develops a new bioform to counter it. When a new defensive strategy proves effective against one hive fleet, the next hive fleet will have already adapted to neutralize it. This directed evolution operates at a speed that would be impossible through natural selection, because it is not natural selection at all. It is intelligent design on a cosmic scale, with the hive mind serving as the architect and the Norn Queens as the builders. The Norn Queens are themselves fascinating creatures. These are the reproductive engines of the hive fleets, massive organisms that dwell at the heart of the largest hive ships and produce every other Tyranid bioform through asexual cloning. Unlike most Tyranid organisms, Norn Queens are self-aware, genuinely intelligent beings that interpret the will of the hive mind and translate it into biological reality. When the hive mind decides that a new type of warrior organism is needed, it is the Norn Queen who takes the available genetic material, splices it together with her own incomprehensible biological expertise, and births the new creature into existence. The Norn Queens also possess a remarkable failsafe. When a Norn Queen dies, the psychic shockwave of her death is so powerful that it temporarily obscures the light of the Astronomicon itself. This phenomenon, known as the Hydra effect, triggers the birth of multiple new Norn Queens from other biovessels that receive the signal. Cut off one head, and two more grow in its place. This means that the Tyranids are functionally impossible to eliminate through conventional decapitation strategies. Killing the leader does not end the threat. It multiplies it. All of this, the Swarmlord's immortality, the Norn Queen's reproductive capacity, as the hive mind's directed evolution paints a picture of a species that is not merely dangerous, but genuinely unkillable on a strategic level. Individual battles can be won. Individual hive fleets can be shattered, but the Tyranid species as a whole simply adapts, learns, and comes back stronger. It is the ultimate expression of the biological imperative to survive and reproduce, taken to an extreme that transforms it from a natural process into something almost supernatural. The Genestealer cults represent perhaps the most insidious aspect of the Tyranid threat, and understanding them is essential to understanding what the hive mind is truly preparing for. Because if the hive fleets are the Tyranid's sword, the Genestealer cults are their poison, as a slow-acting venom that works its way into the bloodstream of civilizations decades or centuries before the killing blow falls. It begins with a single Genestealer, one creature, alone on an alien world, hiding in the darkness beneath a hive city or in the tunnels of a mining colony. The Genestealer is a masterwork of biological engineering, designed not just for combat, but for stealth and infiltration. It can move through darkness with absolute silence. Its chitinous hide can change color to blend with its surroundings. Its hypnotic gaze can paralyze a human being, rendering them docile and compliant, while the genestealer performs the act that will seal the fate of their entire world. The genestealer's ovipositor implants a packet of Tyranid genetic material into the victim. This implantation does not kill. It does not immediately transform. Instead, it rewrites parts of the victim's genome at a fundamental level, binding them to the genestealer through a psychic connection that the victim experiences not as enslavement but as devotion, love even. The infected individual returns to their normal life, outwardly unchanged but inwardly transformed into a willing servant of the growing brood mind. They will protect the genestealer, they will bring others to it, and when they have children, those children will be hybrids. The first generation of hybrids is a horrifying sight, barely recognizable as human, with elongated skulls, extra limbs, and alien features that mark them unmistakably as something other. These creatures are hidden away, raised in secret by the growing cult, their existence concealed from the outside world. The second generation is slightly more human in appearance, and the third more so still. By the fourth generation, the hybrids can pass as normal humans, perhaps a little unusual in appearance, perhaps a touch bald and oddly featured, but nothing that would attract undue attention on a world where genetic mutation is a fact of daily life. And then the fifth generation arrives, and from these human-appearing parents, pure strain genestealers are born anew. The cycle begins again, spreading outward like ripples in a pond, each new generation extending the cult's reach further into the host society. By the time the cult is fully established, it may number in the billions, its members occupying positions of power and influence throughout the world's government, military, industrial base, and religious institutions. They run the factories, but they serve in the planetary defense forces. They sit on governing councils. They preach in the temples. And all the while, the original genestealer, now grown into a massive and psychically potent patriarch, sits at the center of its web, directing its children through the brood mind with absolute authority. The cult members believe they are doing something holy. They worship the patriarch as a divine being and the distant hive fleet as the star children, angelic entities that will descend from the heavens to bring about a glorious day of ascension. They genuinely believe that when the star children arrive, they will be elevated, transformed, made into something beautiful and eternal. The tragic irony is, of course, that the star children are the Tyranids, and the day of ascension is the beginning of the end for every living thing on the planet, including the cultists themselves. When the hive fleet draws close enough for the shadow in the warp to reach the infected world, the brood mind triggers a subliminal reaction that drives the cult into open revolt. The timing is exquisitely calculated. Just as the hive fleet arrives in the system, just as the skies darken with spore clouds and the bioships take position in orbit, the cult erupts from the shadows in a coordinated insurrection that tears the planet's defenses apart from within. Planetary defense forces find themselves fighting not just an alien invasion from above, but a civil war below, as billions of cultists, who were yesterday their friends, family, and comrades in arms, suddenly turn their weapons against them. But the defenders are overwhelmed. The defenses crumble. And as the Tyranid organisms begin their descent to the planet's surface, the cult members throw themselves into ecstatic celebration. The Star Children have come. The day of ascension is here. They rush out to meet the descending swarm with arms spread wide and tears of joy streaming down their faces. And then the Tyranids eat them, every last one of them. The cultists who served the hive mind for decades, who gave their lives and their children's lives to prepare this world for consumption, are devoured alongside the defenders they betrayed. The hive mind has no gratitude, no loyalty, no sense of debt or obligation. The cultists were tools, nothing more, and tools that have served their purpose are recycled along with everything else. As some of the cultists see the truth in those final moments, the psychic connection of the brood mind is overwhelmed and absorbed by the vastly more powerful hive mind, and for the first time, the cultists see the galaxy through the hive mind's eyes. They see themselves as the hive mind sees them, not as children, not as faithful servants, just biomass. The horror of that realization, the absolute shattering of everything the cultists believed and hoped and prayed for, is one of the most grim-dark elements in a setting that is already defined by its grimness and darkness. But from the hive mind's perspective, it is simply efficiency. Why fight for a world when you can make the world fight itself first? Why waste bioforms breaking down defenses when you can have the defenders tear their own defenses down from the inside? As the Genestealer cults are the hive mind's long game, proof that it thinks not just in terms of battles but in terms of decades and centuries and generations. And the Genestealer infestations are spreading. The Great Rift has created chaos throughout the galaxy, sending millions of refugees fleeing from one system to another. Among those refugees, hidden in the desperate crowds, are the carriers of Genestealer infection, unknowing vectors spreading the broodmind's touch to world after world. The Imperium cannot screen them all. It cannot test every refugee for the subtle genetic markers of Genestealer corruption. And so the cults proliferate in the shadows, growing stronger with each passing year, each one a psychic beacon calling the hive fleets ever closer. How many worlds in the Imperium already harbor Genestealer cults? No one knows. The Ordo Xenos of the Inquisition has identified thousands, but their own analysts admit that for every cult they discover, dozens more likely remain hidden. The infection is everywhere. It is in the hive cities and the agri worlds, and the forge worlds and the shrine worlds, and even, according to the darkest whispers, on Terra itself. The entire Imperium is riddled with it, a vast organism already partially digested from within, waiting for the moment when the hive fleets arrive to finish what the cults began. Now we come to one of the most mysterious and troubling elements of the entire Tyranid lore, something that has been quietly building in the background of the setting for years, and whose implications are only now beginning to be appreciated. We need to talk about Hive Fleet Tiamat and what it is building on the world of Xaiophoria. A hive fleet. Tiamat is unique among Tyranid hive fleets, where every other known fleet follows the standard Tyranid pattern of consuming worlds and moving on. Tiamat has done something utterly unprecedented. It has settled. It arrived in the Tiamat system, a relatively unremarkable, double-binary star system on the eastern fringe, sometime around the 35th millennium, roughly 6,000 years before the first major Tyranid invasion of the galaxy. This alone would be remarkable, a Tyranid presence in the galaxy predating Behemoth by millennia. But what Tiamat has done since its arrival is what makes it truly alarming. Instead of stripping the worlds of the Tiamat system of biomass and moving on, Tiamat has claimed them. It has converted the jungle world of Xaiophoria into something that defies easy categorization. The surface of Xaiophoria is dominated by a continent-spanning organic construct, a conical superstructure formed of chitin and soft encephalitic flesh that thrums with immense psychic energy. This structure is not a building in any conventional sense. It is alive, a vast biological machine whose purpose has been the subject of intense speculation among the few Imperial analysts who are aware of its existence. When Eldari Rangers from Craftworld Yanden discovered the structure, several of them went into convulsions upon approaching it, their psychic minds overwhelmed by the sheer force of the shadow in the warp that the structure generates. The structure does not merely project the shadow in the warp, it amplifies it to levels that are orders of magnitude beyond anything produced by a normal hive fleet. The psychic energy radiating from Xaiophoria is so powerful that it has been detected by sensitive instruments thousands of light years away. A Deathwatch kill team was sent to investigate the structure. When they drew close, the structure pulsed, sending a tsunami of psychic energy rolling across the planet. The kill team's librarian, a trained and disciplined psyker, suffered a catastrophic cranial rupture. His skull literally exploded from the psychic force. The remaining Space Marines were hunted down and killed by Tyranid organisms that defended the structure with a ferocity that exceeded even normal Tyranid levels of aggression. Watch Sergeant Gunheim managed to transmit a final warning before he was overwhelmed, and that warning reached Watch Fortress Holtmote, the nearest Deathwatch installation. The theories about what Tiamat is building on Zeophoria are as varied as they are disturbing. Some inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos believe the structure is a psychic beacon, a massive biological transmitter designed to guide additional hive fleets to the galaxy with far greater precision and speed than the original signal from the Pharos. If this is true, then Tiamat is essentially building a lighthouse for the Great Devourer, a permanent navigational aid that will draw the main body of the Tyranid swarm to the Milky Way like moths to a bonfire. The structure is not yet complete, and Tyranid bioships from Hive Fleet Tiamat have been spotted venturing further and further from the system in search of additional biomass to finish the construction. Whatever it is building, it needs more raw material. Our other theorists have proposed even more alarming possibilities. Some believe the structure might be a physical vessel for the hive mind itself, a way of anchoring that vast psychic consciousness to a fixed point in real space. Others suggest it might be a weapon, a psychic resonator capable of projecting the shadow in the warp across an entire segmentum or even further, cutting off vast swathes of the galaxy from psychic communication and warp travel in preparation for a mass invasion. Still others speculate that it might be something entirely beyond human comprehension, a tool designed for a purpose that no human mind can conceptualize, because it is based on biological principles and strategic imperatives that simply do not exist within the framework of human understanding. What we do know is this: our Hive Fleet Tiamat guards its creation with a fanaticism that goes beyond even the normal Tyranid drive to protect valuable assets. Every ship that has ventured near the Tiamat system has been intercepted and destroyed or dragged to Zeophoria to serve as additional biomass. The Hive Fleet has even created its own Genestealer cults, whose leaders instruct their followers to hijack ships and make pilgrimages to the system, delivering themselves willingly to the maw of the swarm. Those cultists, who touched the corrupted earth of Zeophoria with their bare flesh, were instantly enthralled by it, becoming missionaries who traveled back out into the Imperium to recruit more pilgrims. The structure is feeding not just on biomass, but on belief, on devotion, on the psychic energy generated by the faith of the deluded. As the excommunicated Inquisitor Cryptman, the same man who redirected Hive Fleet Leviathan into the Orc Empire of Octarius, has come out of exile to address this threat. He has traveled to Watch Fortress Holtmote to meet with the Watch Commander and formulate a plan to destroy whatever Tiamat is creating on Zeophoria. But the theories they discuss long into the night are so extreme, and the other threats facing the Imperium so dire, that the wider Inquisition has given them little credence. Tiamat is building something vast, something powerful, something that the hive mind considers important enough to deviate from its standard operating procedure of consuming and moving on. Whatever that something is, it has been under construction for 6,000 years, and it is not yet finished. And the fact that the hive mind, as an intelligence that thinks in terms of galaxies and eons, considers this project worth investing 6,000 years of effort into, should tell you everything you need to know about its potential significance. The Tyranids are not the only faction in the galaxy that is aware of the existential nature of the threat they represent. Several other major powers have recognized the Tyranids for what they are and have begun to take steps, however inadequate, to counter them. And the most significant of these responses comes from an unexpected quarter: the Necrons. Zarek, the silent king of the Necrons, is the oldest and most powerful ruler in the galaxy. He was the Necron monarch who made the catastrophic bargain with the Citan star gods that transformed the organic Necrontyre into the soulless machine bodies of the Necrons millions of years ago. Racked by guilt over what he had done to his people, the Silent King exiled himself to the intergalactic void after the war in heaven, commanding his subjects to enter the Great Sleep while he wandered the darkness between galaxies in penance. During his long exile, the Silent King encountered the Tyranids. Out there in the void, drifting between galaxies, he witnessed the approaching hive fleets and understood immediately what they represented. If the Tyranids devoured all life in the galaxy, the Necrons would never be able to reverse the process of biotransference that had stripped them of their organic bodies. Now, the living species that might one day serve as vessels for Necron consciousness would be consumed, and the Necrons would be trapped in their metal shells forever. In 744 of the 41st Millennium, the Silent King broke his self-imposed exile and returned to the galaxy. He has spent the centuries since quietly working to awaken his people from their tomb worlds and unite them against the Tyranid threat. His efforts have included covert alliances with other species, most notably a tense collaboration with the Blood Angels during the Gehenna campaign, where Tyranid forces appeared, and both Necrons and Space Marines were forced to cooperate against the common enemy. During this engagement, the Silent King's proxy revealed that Zarek had once offered a similar alliance to the Primarch Sanguinius during the Horus Heresy, as an alliance that he believed could have prevented the Tyranids from ever reaching the galaxy. What exactly the Silent King wanted Sanguinius to do, and why the alliance never materialized, remains one of the most tantalizing unanswered questions in the lore. The Necrons have capabilities that could theoretically be decisive against the Tyranids. Their weapons are not biological and cannot be adapted against. Their bodies are made of living metal that provides no nutritional value to the swarm. Their technology, including devices capable of extinguishing stars and manipulating the fundamental forces of the universe, represents the kind of power that could potentially hurt the hive mind on a strategic level. But the Necrons are a divided people, their dynasties fractured by millions of years of slumber and internal rivalries. And the Silent King has found it far more difficult to unite his people than he anticipated. Then there is the matter of chaos, and this is where things get really interesting. The Chaos Gods and the Tyranids exist in a state of mutual hostility that goes beyond mere competition for territory. Chaos is fueled by the emotions and souls of sentient beings. Every thought, every feeling, every prayer and curse and moment of passion adds to the power of the warp and sustains the Chaos Gods. The Tyranids, by consuming all sentient life, are effectively starving the Chaos Gods. Every world the swarm devours is a world whose inhabitants will never again generate the psychic energy that chaos feeds upon. This makes the Tyranids a threat to chaos on a fundamental level, not a rival to be fought and conquered, but an existential threat to the very food supply that sustains the ruinous powers. If the Tyranids were to consume all sentient life in the galaxy, the Chaos Gods would starve. Their power would diminish, their domains would shrink, and eventually they might simply fade away, their bloated forms deflating like balloons as the psychic energy that sustains them is consumed along with everything else. The hive mind, for its part, finds chaos equally problematic, but for entirely different reasons. The raw material of chaos, the warp stuff from which demons are made, offers no sustenance to the Tyranids. It contains no biomass, no useful genetic material, nothing that the Norn queens can use to produce new bioforms. Chaos-corrupted matter is equally useless, tainted by warp energies that render it nutritionally worthless. And this means that every world claimed by chaos, every system swallowed by the Great Rift, every population corrupted by the ruinous powers, is effectively a wasted resource from the Tyranids' perspective. The Great Rift is not just a political and military problem for the Imperium. It is a logistical problem for the hive mind, a vast swath of otherwise consumable biomass rendered inedible by warp contamination. The hive mind's response to this problem has been characteristically elegant and terrifying. It has spawned Hive Fleet Kronos, a specialized fleet designed specifically to combat chaos. Kronos is unlike any other hive fleet in the galaxy. Where most Tyranid forces prefer close combat, Kronos maintains distance, engaging its prey with devastating ranged bioweapons while keeping the warp-tainted enemy at arm's length. Where most hive fleets generate a powerful shadow in the warp as a side effect of their psychic presence, Kronos generates a shadow in the warp so overwhelmingly intense that it can prevent demons from manifesting in real space entirely. At its most concentrated, the shadow in the warp projected by Kronos can actually close warp rifts, sealing tears in reality that would otherwise pour demonic forces into the material universe. Kronos has been traced following a core-ward path along the line of the Great Rift, systematically engaging and destroying chaos-corrupted forces wherever it finds them. In one remarkable engagement, a tendril of Kronos entered a naval battle between Imperial and Chaos forces and completely ignored the Imperial ships, instead driving straight into the Chaos formation and destroying a massive despoiler-class battleship at the center of the traitor fleet. The Imperial Admiral, wisely choosing not to question his good fortune, ordered his forces to withdraw and let the Tyranids finish the job. The fact that the hive mind has dedicated an entire hive fleet to combating chaos tells us something important about its strategic priorities. The hive mind is not merely reacting to threats as they appear. It is actively managing the battlefield environment of the entire galaxy, ensuring that the resources it intends to consume are not rendered unusable by chaos contamination. It is thinking not just about the next battle or the next world, but about the long-term viability of the entire galactic buffet. And this leads us to what is perhaps the most important question we can ask about the Tyranids. Not where they came from, or how they fight, or even how many of them there are. But rather, what is the endgame? What is the hive mind's ultimate purpose? What are the Tyranids preparing for? This is where we enter the realm of theory and speculation. But it is informed speculation, grounded in the patterns and evidence that the lore has provided. And I want to be clear about what is established fact and what is theory as we explore these possibilities, because the line between them is important. The simplest explanation for the Tyranids' behavior is that they are exactly what they appear to be: an extragalactic superorganism driven by an insatiable hunger to consume all biological matter in the universe. They have devoured other galaxies, yet now they are devouring ours. When they are finished, they will move on to the next one. There is no grand purpose, no hidden agenda, no secret plan, just hunger, operating on a cosmic scale and a geological timescale. This is the explanation that the lore most directly supports. When Dante looked into the soul of the hive mind, what he found was hunger, and nothing but hunger. The hive mind does not scheme in the way that humans, or Eldari, or even chaos gods scheme. It simply hungers, and it acts to satisfy that hunger with the efficiency of a force of nature. This interpretation has a certain elegant horror to it. The idea that the greatest threat to the galaxy is not a dark god or an evil empire, but an appetite, a biological process so vast and so mindless that it has become indistinguishable from cosmic entropy, is profoundly unsettling in a way that a conventional villain could never be. You cannot reason with hunger. You cannot defeat hunger. You can only feed it and hope that it turns its attention elsewhere before it has consumed everything you hold dear. In this reading, the Tyranids are not villains at all. They are a natural disaster, a hurricane with teeth, a wildfire made of chitin and bioacid. And natural disasters do not have endgames. They simply happen. But there are elements in the lore that suggest something more might be going on. Elements that hint at purpose and planning beyond simple consumption. Elements that, when assembled together, paint a picture of a hive mind that is not merely hungry, but actively working towards something. Consider the evidence. An hive fleet. Tiamat is building a continent-spanning psychic resonator on Xyophoria, a project that has consumed 6,000 years of effort and resources. The structure generates psychic energy of a magnitude that dwarfs anything produced by a normal hive fleet. It is not a feeding structure. It is not a weapon in any conventional sense. It is something new, something that the Tyranids have never been observed creating before. And the hive mind guards it with a level of investment that suggests it is vitally important to whatever long-term plan the swarm is executing. Consider that the hive fleets are arriving from multiple directions around the galaxy, not just from one point in the void. Behemoth came from the east, Leviathan came from the south. The Fourth Tyrannic War is occurring in the west. This suggests that the Tyranid presence in the intergalactic void is not a single fleet, but a vast encirclement, with tendrils approaching the Milky Way from all sides simultaneously. The galaxy is not being invaded, it is being surrounded. Consider Hive Fleet Kronos and its dedicated campaign against chaos. The hive mind is not just consuming biomass, it is actively managing the galaxy's resources, ensuring that the warp does not render too much of the galaxy's biomass unusable before the Tyranids can consume it. This is not the behavior of a mindless eating machine. This is resource management on a galactic scale, the kind of strategic thinking that implies a plan that extends far beyond the next meal. Consider the way the Tyranids have been escalating their invasions, testing different approaches with each successive wave, learning from defeats and targeting the galaxy at moments of maximum vulnerability. Consider the Genestealer cults spreading across millions of worlds, preparing them for consumption decades in advance. Consider the Swarm Lord, an immortal general with millions of years of experience, manifested only when the hive mind requires its best strategic thinking. One popular theory among both fans and in-universe scholars is that the Tyranids are fleeing from something. The idea is that the hive mind is not traveling toward the Milky Way with predatory intent, but away from something in its home galaxy or galaxies that threatens even the Great Devourer. In this reading, the Tyranids are not the ultimate predators of the universe, but prey, running from something so terrible that they are willing to cross the intergalactic void to escape it. Yet the consumption of galaxies along the way is simply fueling, the biological equivalent of eating on the run, burning through resources to stay ahead of whatever is chasing them. There is a certain narrative appeal to this theory. It would reframe the Tyranids from apex predators to tragic refugees, driven to desperate measures by a threat that makes their own considerable horror look small by comparison. And there are some tantalizing bits of lore that could be interpreted as supporting it. The Silent King encountered the Tyranids in the intergalactic void and was disturbed enough to end millions of years of exile and return to the galaxy to prepare for their arrival. What exactly did he see out there? Was it just the hive fleets? Or was it something else, something behind them, something that even the Tyranids were afraid of? But I should be clear that this theory is not supported by the canon lore. It is a fan theory, one that some members of the Ordo Xenos have proposed within the fiction, but one for which there is no definitive evidence. The Horus Heresy novel Pharos strongly suggests that the Tyranids were drawn to the galaxy by the psychic signal of the Pharos device, not that they were fleeing toward it. And the behavior of the hive fleets once they arrived, the slow and methodical testing of defenses, the patience of the Genestealer cult infiltrations, the careful resource management of Hive Fleet Kronos, none of it suggests the desperate haste of a species on the run. A fleeing species does not spend 6,000 years building a psychic resonator on a remote jungle world. As a fleeing species does not send its scouts ahead by centuries to infiltrate and corrupt the worlds in its path. A fleeing species attacks with everything it has all at once because it does not have the luxury of patience. The Tyranids have patience in abundance. Another theory, more speculative still but deeply intriguing, is that the Tyranids were created, not evolved naturally, but designed and released by some ancient intelligence as a failsafe, a galaxy-spanning biological cleanup mechanism intended to erase corruption. The Old Ones, those ancient and powerful beings who fought the war in heaven against the Necrons and Satan millions of years ago, created entire species to serve as weapons in that conflict. The Eldari, the Orcs, the Krork, all were engineered by the Old Ones for specific purposes. But could the Tyranids be another such creation? One designed to activate when the galaxy became too corrupted by the warp. consuming everything and starting the cycle of life over again from scratch. This theory would explain several otherwise puzzling aspects of the Tyranids. Their immunity to chaos corruption, their generation of the shadow in the warp, which suppresses chaos manifestations, Hive Fleet Kronos' dedicated campaign against chaos forces, the way the Tyranids consume everything, leaving behind barren worlds that are clean of all warp contamination. If the Tyranids were designed as anti-chaos weapons, then their behavior makes a terrible kind of sense. They are not invading the galaxy, they are sterilizing it, burning out the infection of chaos the only way that works, by removing everything that chaos feeds upon. As this theory is also speculative and unconfirmed by the lore, but it is worth considering because it connects several dots in a way that a simple hunger narrative does not. And then there is perhaps the most disturbing theory of all. The hive mind is growing. With every galaxy consumed, with every species devoured, with every genome added to its library, and every organism added to its psychic gestalt, the hive mind becomes more powerful. Its consciousness expands, its reach extends, its intelligence deepens. Some imperial theorists and certain Eldari farseers have speculated that the hive mind is not merely consuming the galaxy's biomass, but evolving towards something, approaching a threshold of psychic power and biological complexity that will transform it into something new, something that has never existed before, something that, but once it crosses that threshold, may become a force comparable to the chaos gods themselves, a god of the material universe to match the gods of the warp. If this is true, then the consumption of galaxies is not the goal, but the gestation period. The hive mind is not eating the universe. It is using the universe to build itself, adding biomass and psychic energy and genetic diversity to its own being with every world it devours. The Tyranid hive fleets are not armies. They are the cellular processes of a god in the process of being born. Imagine that for a moment. A god that is not made of faith or emotion or warp energy, but of flesh and chitin and the accumulated biological heritage of 1 million extinct species. A god whose body spans galaxies and whose mind encompasses the psychic energy of trillions of organisms. Or a god that does not dwell in some other dimension, but exists here, in the material universe, as real and as physical as the stars themselves. That is what the Tyranids might be preparing for. Not the consumption of one galaxy, but the birth of something that will reshape the fundamental nature of reality. And by the time anyone realizes what is happening, it will be far, far too late to stop it. Or perhaps the truth is simpler and more terrifying than any theory can capture. Perhaps the Tyranids are preparing for exactly what they appear to be preparing for, which is the total consumption of all life in the Milky Way galaxy, followed by the total consumption of the next galaxy, and the next, and the next, until there is nothing left in the universe but the Tyranids and the empty husks of the worlds they have stripped bare. Perhaps the endgame is not a dramatic transformation or a hidden purpose, but simply the end of all things, the slow and patient and unstoppable conversion of all matter in the universe from living diversity into Tyranid uniformity. And perhaps that is the most grimdark ending of all. Not a final battle or a great betrayal or a cosmic revelation, but a quiet extinction, world by world, galaxy by galaxy, until the last light goes out and the last voice falls silent, and there is nothing left but the swarm, drifting through an empty universe, still hungry, forever hungry, with nothing left to eat. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is full of horrors, chaos demons and traitor legions and ancient machines that predate the human species by millions of years. But none of them compare to the Tyranids, because none of them threaten the existence of everything. Chaos wants to corrupt the galaxy. The Necrons want to rule it. The Orcs want to fight in it. Only the Tyranids want to consume it entirely, to leave nothing behind, to reduce the teeming diversity of 100 billion worlds to nothing but the endless, mindless, all-consuming hunger of the swarm. And they are patient. They have crossed the void between galaxies. They have invested thousands of years in building psychic resonators and infiltrating civilizations. They have tested the galaxy's defenses with probe after probe, learning from every encounter, adapting to every strategy, becoming better and stronger and more dangerous with every passing century. Whatever they are preparing for, they are preparing thoroughly. And when the time comes for the full weight of the swarm to fall upon the galaxy, when the tendrils that have been testing and probing and learning finally draw together into a single, overwhelming tide, the defenders of the Milky Way may find that all their wars and all their sacrifices and all their desperate heroism was only ever a prelude to the real battle, a battle they may not be prepared to fight. But that is the nature of the grimdark future. There is only war, and the war never ends, and the enemies never stop coming. The Tyranids are simply the most extreme expression of that truth, a threat so vast and so implacable that it makes every other conflict in the galaxy look like a squabble between children fighting over scraps at a dinner table that is about to be cleared away entirely. Yeah, so the next time you look up at the stars on a clear night, remember that something is looking back. Something old and patient and unspeakably hungry. Something that has eaten galaxies and will eat more. Something that is, even now, drawing closer, testing your defenses, learning your weaknesses, and preparing for the moment when it will descend upon everything you know and love and reduce it to raw material for the eternal expansion of the swarm. But we are not done yet. Not by a long distance. Because there are layers to this threat that go deeper than military strategy and biological warfare. There are dimensions to the Tyranid invasion that touch on the fundamental nature of reality itself, on the relationship between the material universe and the psychic dimension that underlies it, and on the possibility that the hive mind's true purpose is not merely the consumption of flesh, but the transformation of something far more profound. To understand that, we need to examine what might be the most underappreciated and most philosophically terrifying aspect of the entire Tyranid phenomenon. I want to return now to something that we touched on earlier, but that deserves much deeper exploration: the relationship between the Tyranids and the warp, and what it reveals about the nature of the hive mind and the deeper structure of the Warhammer 40K universe. Because this relationship, which is one of mutual hostility and fundamental incompatibility, might hold the key to understanding what the Tyranids are actually doing here. The warp, for those who might need a refresher, is an alternate dimension of pure psychic energy that underlies the material universe. It is shaped by the thoughts and emotions of sentient beings, and it is home to the Chaos Gods, vast intelligences born from the accumulated psychic residue of billions of years of mortal suffering, desire, rage, and despair. The warp is where souls go when mortal bodies die. It is the medium through which psychers channel their powers. It is the dimension through which Imperial ships travel when they need to cross the vast distances between star systems. And it is the source of virtually every supernatural phenomenon in the setting, from demonic possession to psychic warfare to the golden light of the Astronomicon itself. The Tyranids exist in a deeply strange relationship with the warp. They are not of it, in the way that demons are. They are material creatures, born and raised in the physical universe, their bodies made of flesh and chitin and biological chemistry rather than condensed psychic energy. And yet the hive mind, that vast gestalt consciousness that governs the entire species, has a psychic presence that is staggeringly powerful. The shadow in the warp is not a technological effect or a biological byproduct in any simple sense. It is the psychic weight of the hive mind pressing against the fabric of the warp itself, dampening it, suppressing it, drowning out its native energies the way the roar of a waterfall drowns out whispered conversation. This is a crucial distinction that I think gets lost in a lot of discussions about the Tyranids. The hive mind does not use the warp in the way that human psychers or Eldari seers use it. It does not draw power from the warp to fuel its abilities. Instead, it generates its own psychic field from the collective consciousness of trillions of Tyranid organisms, a field so massive and so alien that it overwhelms the local warp environment simply by existing. The Tyranid psychic field and the warp are not the same thing. They are competing forces, operating in the same psychic dimension, but fundamentally opposed in nature. Where the warp is chaotic, emotional, driven by desire and fear and every shade of sentient feeling, the hive mind's psychic presence is cold, focused, unified, and utterly without the individual emotional signatures that the warp feeds upon. This is why the Chaos Gods find the Tyranids so threatening, not because the Tyranids are militarily powerful, though they certainly are. Not because the Tyranids consume the mortal species whose emotions feed the warp, though they do that too, but because the very existence of the hive mind represents a fundamental challenge to the nature of the warp itself. The Chaos Gods exist because sentient beings feel emotions. Remove those beings, and the Chaos Gods starve. But the hive mind takes it a step further. By projecting its own alien consciousness into the psychic dimension, the hive mind does not merely deprive the warp of emotional fuel, it actively suppresses the warp's native energies, pushing them back, dampening their influence, creating zones of psychic dead space where demons cannot manifest and chaos cannot take root. Imagine the warp as a bonfire. The emotions of sentient beings are the fuel that keeps it burning. The Chaos Gods are the shapes that the fire takes, fed by specific types of fuel: rage for Khorne, despair for Nurgle, excess for Slanesh, ambition for Tzeentch. Now, imagine the hive mind as a vast wave of cold water approaching that bonfire from all directions simultaneously. As the wave advances, the fire retreats, not because the water is fighting the fire with fire, but because water and fire are fundamentally incompatible. The hive mind does not need to defeat chaos in combat. It just needs to exist in sufficient density and proximity, and chaos weakens, fades, and eventually goes dark. This dynamic gives a new and unsettling dimension to the Tyranid invasion. The Tyranids are not just consuming the galaxy's biomass, they are fundamentally altering the galaxy's psychic landscape. Every world they consume removes a source of warp energy from the equation. Every hive fleet that passes through a sector leaves behind not just stripped worlds, but quieted warp space, areas where the Imperium is calmer and less chaotic than it was before the Tyranids arrived. The shadow in the warp is not just a weapon of war, it is a preview of what the galaxy would look like if the Tyranids won completely. A universe of dead, silent matter with no warp influence at all, no psychic activity, no emotional resonance, no demons, no gods, no souls. Just the hive mind and the biomass it has consumed, existing in a perfectly sterile psychic void of its own creation. Is this deliberate? Is the hive mind consciously working to suppress chaos? Or is it merely a side effect of its nature? The existence of Hive Fleet Kronos suggests that it is, one at the very least, aware of the dynamic and willing to exploit it. Kronos does not merely generate the shadow in the warp as a passive byproduct of its psychic presence. It actively directs and focuses it as a weapon against chaos, using concentrated psychic output to close warp rifts and banish daemons. This is not the behavior of an organism generating an incidental side effect. This is the behavior of an intelligence that understands the warp well enough to weaponize its own ability to suppress it. And this brings us to a theory that I find particularly compelling, though I want to emphasize again that it is speculative rather than confirmed by the law. What if the endgame of the Tyranid invasion is not the consumption of the galaxy's biomass, but the elimination of the galaxy's warp influence? What if the true purpose of the Great Devourer is not to eat, but to cleanse, to strip away the psychic contamination that has allowed chaos to flourish and replace it with the cold, unified, utterly controlled psychic environment of the hive mind? In this reading, the Tyranids are not predators, but antibodies. The galaxy is a body, and chaos is a disease that has infected it. The Tyranids are the immune response, dispatched by some mechanism we do not understand to consume the infected tissue and replace it with something that cannot be infected. The consumption of biomass is not the goal. It is the method by which the Tyranids generate the psychic density necessary to suppress the warp. More organisms means a stronger shadow in the warp, which means a wider area of psychic suppression, which means less territory for chaos to operate in. The Great Devourer devours not because it is hungry, but because devouring is how it generates the psychic mass needed to push back the darkness of the Imperium. This theory would explain Hive Fleet Kronos perfectly. It would explain why the hive mind goes out of its way to avoid warp-corrupted areas that offer no nutritional value but still need to be cleared. It would explain the Tiamat structure as a permanent psychic suppression beacon, anchoring the shadow in the warp to a fixed point rather than relying on the mobile presence of hive fleets. And it would explain the seemingly wasteful pattern of stripping worlds down to bare rock. The Tyranids are not just eating the biosphere, they are removing everything that contributes to the warp's energy. Every living soul, every spark of emotion, every whisper of psychic potential, but leaving behind a universe of clean, cold stone that the warp cannot touch. But even if this theory is correct, it offers no comfort to the galaxy's inhabitants. The Tyranids' method of cleansing the galaxy involves the extinction of every living thing in it. Whatever benefit might result from the suppression of chaos, the cost is total. Every species, every civilization, every individual consciousness, all of it consumed to fuel the hive mind's war against the warp. The cure is indistinguishable from the disease, at least from the perspective of the patient. Let us talk for a moment about the broader strategic picture as it stands in the current era of the setting, because understanding where all the pieces are on the board is essential to understanding what the Tyranids' next move might be. The galaxy in the 42nd millennium is a galaxy at war on every front. The Great Rift, that massive tear in reality that was created by the fall of Cadia and the machinations of the chaos god Tzeentch, has split the Imperium in two. The half of the Imperium on the far side of the rift, known as the Imperium Nihilus, or the Dark Imperium, is cut off from the light of the Astronomicon and from effective communication with Terra. Billions of Imperial citizens live in perpetual darkness, their worlds beset by chaos incursions, Xenos raids, and the general collapse of interstellar civilization. The Imperium Sanctus, the half that still sees the Astronomicon's light, is only marginally better off. Its resources stretched to the breaking point by the Indomitus Crusade and the ongoing wars against Chaos, Orcs, Necrons, and a dozen lesser threats. Into this chaos, the Tyranids are advancing on multiple fronts. The Fourth Tyrannic War in the Segmentum Pacificus is the most immediate and dramatic threat, with Hive Fleet Leviathan's tendrils pushing closer to the Segmentum Solar and Terra itself than any previous invasion. But it is far from the only Tyranid activity in the galaxy. Splinter fleets from previous Tyrannic wars are still active across the Eastern Fringe and the Segmentum Ultima, consuming small worlds and rebuilding their strength in the shadows. Hive Fleet Tiamat continues to build its mysterious structure on Zeophoria, defended by an ever-growing fleet of bioships. Hive Fleet Kronos patrols the edges of the Great Rift, engaging chaos forces and claiming worlds that might otherwise fall to corruption. And Genestealer cults continue to spread throughout the Imperium, their numbers growing with each passing year, their psychic beacons calling the distant hive fleets ever closer. The Imperium's ability to respond to these threats is severely compromised. The Indomitus Crusade has consumed an enormous proportion of the Imperium's military resources, drawing forces away from other theaters to prosecute the war against chaos. The Primaris Space Marines, those enhanced warriors created by Belisarius Cawl over the course of 10,000 years of secret development, have bolstered the Adeptus Astartes significantly, but even their enhanced capabilities are spread thin across a galaxy that is burning on every border. The return of Primarch Robut Guilliman has provided the Imperium with leadership it has not had in 10 millennia, but even a Primarch cannot be everywhere at once, and the demands on his attention are effectively infinite. The result is that the Imperium is fighting a holding action on almost every front. It is not winning. It is not losing. It is enduring, which is what the Imperium has always done, but the margin of endurance is growing thinner with each passing century. And the Tyranids, patient as always, are watching and waiting for the moment when that margin finally disappears. The other major factions are in similar states of crisis. The Aeldari, both Craftworld and Drukhari, are fighting their own slow war against extinction, their population too small and their reproduction too slow to sustain the kinds of losses that war against the Tyranids demands. The Tau Empire, the youngest and most optimistic of the galaxy's civilizations, it has encountered the Tyranids on multiple occasions and been shocked each time by the sheer alien incomprehensibility of the threat. Hive Fleet Gorgon, a relatively small tendril that specifically targeted Tow worlds, was eventually defeated, but only because the Tow's rapid technological innovation allowed them to adapt faster than the Tyranids could evolve to counter them. It was a narrow victory, and one that the Tow leadership understands may not be repeatable against a larger fleet. The Necrons under the Silent King represent perhaps the most capable potential counterforce to the Tyranids, but the Necrons are divided, their dynasties pursuing individual agendas that often conflict with Sarek's grand strategy. The Silent King's Pariah Nexus campaign, an effort to create zones of psychic deadness using Necron technology, or may have anti-Tyranid applications. But it has also brought the Necrons into direct conflict with the Imperium, adding another war to an already overextended list. And through it all, the Tyranids continue to arrive. New tendrils detected at the galaxy's edge, new splinter fleets identified in regions that were thought to be clear, new Genestealer cult uprisings reported on worlds that had passed every previous purity check. The swarm is growing, the net is closing, and the defenders of the galaxy, for all their courage and sacrifice and stubborn refusal to yield, are running out of space to retreat to. This is the strategic reality that frames the question of what the Tyranids are preparing for. They do not need some grand secret weapon or hidden plan to win. They just need to keep doing what they are already doing. They're grinding down the galaxy's defenses through patience and attrition and the simple mathematical fact that they have more organisms than the galaxy has soldiers. Every century that passes tilts the balance further in the hive mind's favor. Every war the galaxy's factions fight among themselves weakens them and strengthens the Tyranids by leaving more worlds undefended and more populations available for consumption. The Tyranids are preparing for the moment when the balance tips beyond recovery. The moment when the galaxy's defenders can no longer muster the resources to resist effectively. The moment when the hive fleets can advance without meaningful opposition, consuming world after world in a cascading wave of extinction that accelerates as it grows, and each consumed world feeding the production of new organisms that consume the next world faster. The tipping point. The moment when the great devourer stops probing and starts feeding in earnest. And the most terrifying thing about that tipping point is that nobody knows when it will arrive. It might be centuries away. It might be decades. It might already have passed, with the current generation simply not yet aware that the balance has shifted irrevocably against them. The hive mind might already know. The hive mind might have calculated the exact point at which the galaxy's defenses will crumble, the precise moment when resistance becomes futile and consumption becomes inevitable. And it might simply be waiting, patiently, for that moment to arrive, content in the knowledge that time is on its side. While because time has always been on the side of the Tyranids, they have crossed the void between galaxies. They have consumed civilizations that were ancient before humanity existed. They have been building their strength and refining their methods for millions or billions of years. What is another century or two of patience to an intelligence that measures its life in eons? Nothing. A blink, a heartbeat of cosmic time. And then the feeding begins. Think about that as you drift off tonight. Think about the silence between the stars. and the things that move within it, and the vast, patient, unstoppable hunger that is drawing closer with every passing moment. Think about the galaxy burning on every border, its defenders stretched thin and growing thinner, while something old and terrible and unimaginably numerous closes in from the edges. Think about the Genestealer cults spreading through the underhives and the mining colonies and the refugee camps, building their psychic beacons, calling the swarm. Think about the structure on Zeophoria, pulsing with psychic energy, broadcasting its signal into the void. Think about the Swarm Lord, ancient and immortal, carrying the accumulated warfare experience of 1 million extinct civilizations in its reborn consciousness. Think about all of that, and then ask yourself, what are the Tyranids preparing for? The answer, whatever it is, will define the future of the galaxy. And we may not have much time left to figure it out. Are fighting a war that gets harder with every engagement. There is no steady state. There is no equilibrium. The balance of power tilts further toward the Tyranids with every century that passes. And the rate of that tilting is itself increasing. The defenders of the galaxy are not losing slowly. They are losing at an accelerating pace, each defeat compounding the next, each victory teaching the enemy how to ensure that the same tactics never succeed again. This is the cruel mathematics of the Tyranid threat, and it is why the question of what the hive mind is preparing for carries such terrible weight. Because whatever the answer turns out to be, the galaxy's ability to resist it is diminishing with every passing day. The window of opportunity for meaningful defense is closing, and the hive mind, which has been playing this game across galaxies and eons, knows exactly how much time remains. It is worth pausing here to consider what this means for individual worlds, for the billions of ordinary human beings who live their lives under the shadow of a threat they can barely comprehend. On most Imperial worlds, the Tyranids are a distant abstraction, a horror story told by veterans and preachers, something that happens to other people on other worlds, in other sectors. Life goes on. Factories produce their quotas. Tithes are paid. Prayers are offered to the Emperor. The rhythms of Imperial existence continue much as they have for 10,000 years, punctuated by the usual hardships of war and plague, and the grinding poverty that is the lot of the average Imperial citizen. But beneath that normalcy, the infection spreads. The fourth-generation hybrid who works in the administratum office, processing refugee applications with a smile that never quite reaches her strangely luminous eyes. The mine foreman who holds prayer meetings in the deepest tunnels, meetings that no outsider has ever attended, and from which workers emerge with a peculiar calm and a fierce new sense of purpose. The naval rating who has served aboard the same transport ship for 20 years, and who has, without anyone noticing, subtly altered the ship's course on 3 separate occasions to pass through systems that just happen to be on the approach vector of a distant hive fleet tendril. The cults grow, the beacons pulse, the hive fleets draw closer, and the ordinary people of the Imperium go about their lives, unaware that the ground beneath their feet has already been claimed, that the air they breathe is already being tested by microscopic advanced organisms, that the world they call home has already been catalogued in the hive mind's vast database of future meals. This is the horror that operates on a timescale too long for mortal minds to fully grasp. The Tyranids are not coming. They are already here. They have been here for centuries, in some cases millennia, spreading their infection through the Genestealer cults, mapping the galaxy's defenses through their vanguard organisms, building their psychic infrastructure on worlds like Zeophoria. The invasion is not something that will happen in the future. It is something that is happening right now, in slow motion, across millions of worlds simultaneously. And when the slow phase ends and the fast phase begins, when the hive fleets arrive in force and the cults rise up and the shadow in the warp falls across entire segmentums, it will be too late for preparation, too late for reinforcement, too late for anything except the desperate, doomed resistance of species fighting for survival against an enemy that has already consumed everything that came before them. The Tyranids are not preparing for a battle, they are preparing for a harvest, and the crop is almost ripe. There is a line from the lore that I keep returning to, a quote attributed to Inquisitor Bronislaw Chevak, spoken at the conclave of Ha. He said, and I am paraphrasing here, that there is a cancer eating at the Imperium, that with each decade it advances deeper, leaving drained dead worlds in its wake, that this horror has thought and purpose, which functions on an unimaginable, galactic scale, and all we can do is try to stop the swarms of bioengineered monsters it unleashes upon us by instinct. He said that we have given the horror a name to salve our fears, that we call it the Tyranid race, but if it is aware of us at all, it must know us only as prey. Prey. That single word contains the entire truth of the Tyranid threat. Not enemies, not adversaries, not even obstacles. Prey. Something to be hunted and consumed and forgotten. Something that exists only to feed the hunger of something larger and older and more terrible than anything the galaxy has ever produced. And the prey is beginning to understand, dimly and too late, that the predator has been among them all along. Watching, waiting, preparing, growing stronger with every meal, every battle, every world consumed, and every genome catalogued, and every psychic beacon that pulses its signal into the hungry dark between the stars. What are the Tyranids preparing for? And everything. But before we get into the deeper theories and the endgame speculation, I want to spend some time with you on something that I think gets overlooked in a lot of Tyranid discussions. I want to talk about the experience of facing the Tyranids, not the strategy, not the statistics, not the coldly analytical assessment of force ratios and biomass consumption rates. I want to talk about what it feels like to stand on the walls of a fortress world and watch the horizon darken with chitin. What it is like to be the last living thing on a dying planet. Because I think understanding that experience is essential to understanding why the Tyranids are the most fundamentally horrifying threat in the entire Warhammer 40K setting, and why what they are preparing for matters so much. Imagine you are a soldier, a regular human being in the Astra Militarum, the Imperium's vast conscript army. You have been trained to fight. You have been drilled and disciplined and taught the litanies of the God Emperor. You have faced orc warherds and seen their crude but devastating violence. You have fought chaos cultists and witnessed the madness of the warp touched. You have seen terrible things, and you have endured them, because that is what soldiers of the Imperium do. You endure. And then you are deployed to a world that has been identified as a target of Hive Fleet Leviathan. You arrive with your regiment, thousands of men and women with laser guns and determination, and you are told to hold the line. You dig in, you set up your firing positions, you say your prayers, and you wait. The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the silence of a peaceful world, but a silence that feels wrong. The birds have stopped singing. The insects have gone quiet. Even the wind seems to carry a weight that it did not carry before. A heaviness that presses against your chest and makes your heart beat faster, for no reason you can identify. The astropaths are screaming, not metaphorically, literally screaming, clutching their heads and writhing on the ground as the shadow in the warp begins to press down upon the planet. Communications with off-world assets are becoming unreliable. Messages arrive garbled, incomplete, or not at all. The regiment's psychers are sedated and restrained after one of them begins to claw out her own eyes while muttering in a language that none of the other soldiers recognize. Then the sky changes. Not all at once, but gradually. The way a bruise spreads across skin. The stars begin to disappear, blotted out by something that the augur arrays describe as a dense particulate cloud in the upper atmosphere, but that everyone knows, on some deep and primal level, is something far worse than dust. The temperature drops, not dramatically, but enough to notice, enough to make you pull your greatcoat a little tighter and blow on your hands, and wonder why the fires in the camp seem to give off less warmth than they did yesterday. Then the spores begin to fall. They look almost beautiful at first, drifting down from the darkened sky like snow on a winter world. Small, iridescent, catching what little light remains and scattering it into brief rainbows before they settle onto the ground and begin their work. Within hours, the vegetation near the landing zones begins to change. The grass turns grey, then black, then dissolves into a thin slurry that seeps into the soil. The trees shed their leaves and develop growths, fungal or worse, that spread across their bark like disease. The air develops a sweet, sickly smell that reminds some soldiers of rotting fruit and others of fresh blood. This is tyrannoforming, the biological reconfiguration of a world's ecosystem to suit the needs of the hive fleet. And it has begun before the first warrior organism has even made landfall. The planet is being digested from the inside out, its native biosphere broken down by trillions of microscopic Tyranid organisms to create conditions favorable for the larger bioforms that will follow. You are standing on a world that is already being eaten, and there is nothing you can do about it except wait for the main course to arrive. When the main force comes, it comes all at once, and it comes from everywhere. The mycetic spores crash down like meteors, each one disgorging clutches of Tyranid organisms that unfurl from their biological packaging and immediately begin moving toward the nearest concentration of defenders. The sound is indescribable. Millions of chitinous legs and claws striking the ground in a rhythm that sounds almost like rain, if rain were hungry and had teeth. The screaming of the creatures themselves, a shrill, keening wail that is produced not by vocal cords, but by specialized resonance chambers in their thoraxes, designed by the hive mind specifically to induce terror in the prey species it has studied and catalogued. The first wave is termagants and hormagants, the basic infantry of the swarm, and they come in numbers that make counting meaningless. They fill the killing ground in front of your position, like water filling a basin, and your laser gun fires and fires and fires, and each shot that hits drops one of them. But there are always more behind it, stepping over the fallen without pause or hesitation, driven forward by the irresistible will of the hive mind. Your hands are shaking, not from fear, though fear is certainly present, but from the sheer physical strain of holding the trigger and sweeping the beam across an endless tide of targets that never stops coming. The hormagants reach your position first. They are fast, horrifyingly fast, bounding over obstacles and leaping into the trenches with their scything talons extended. The fighting becomes hand-to-hand, which is exactly what the hive mind wants, because a hormagant in close combat is worth 10 at range. Your bayonet finds a joint in the creature's exoskeleton, and you feel the blade scrape against something hard and foreign inside. And then the thing's claw catches your arm, and you feel the pressure, incredible pressure, and then pain, and then nothing below the elbow, and you are screaming and backing away, and the creature is already turning to the next soldier, your severed arm still clutched in its talons, forgotten, because there is no malice in it, no satisfaction, just the mechanical efficiency of a tool designed for a single purpose. And behind the gaunts come the bigger things, the warriors, standing twice the height of a man, their enhanced senses scanning the battlefield for threats and relaying information back through the synaptic web to the hive tyrants that command the swarm. The carnifexes, massive biological tanks that lumber through the killing fields, with an almost casual disregard for the concentrated firepower directed against them. Their armoured carapaces deflecting lasgun fire the way you might brush aside a light breeze. The hive tyrants themselves, towering above the swarm, their psychic presence a physical weight that presses down on every human mind in their vicinity, making thoughts sluggish and will fragile. And the whole time, from the moment the spores began to fall to the moment the last defender falls silent, the shadow in the warp hangs over everything like a funeral shroud. You cannot call for help, you cannot receive reinforcements, or you are alone, cut off, abandoned to the mercy of something that does not know what mercy means. The loneliness of that realization, the absolute isolation of fighting and dying on a world that has already been written off by whatever distant authority assigned you here is almost worse than the physical danger. You die knowing that no one is coming, that your sacrifice, however brave, however noble, will not matter. The world will fall. The Tyranids will consume everything upon it, and in a decade or a century, nothing will remain to show that you ever existed. This is what the defenders of the Imperium face every time a hive fleet descends upon a world. Not a battle between armies, but the experience of being prey, of being hunted by something so vast and so indifferent that your individual fate is genuinely meaningless to it. You are calories, you are protein chains and mineral content, you are raw material waiting to be processed. And that is what makes the Tyranids so fundamentally different from every other threat in the setting. Chaos offers corruption and damnation, but also power. The Orcs offer violence, but also the twisted joy of combat. The Necrons offer a cold and mechanical death, but one that at least acknowledges your existence as an obstacle worth overcoming. The Tyranids offer nothing. They take everything and give nothing back. They are the end of stories, the termination of narratives, the point at which meaning itself dissolves into biological slurry and is pumped into the belly of a hive ship. And that brings us back to the question of what the Tyranids are preparing for, because the answer, whatever it turns out to be, will determine whether there are any stories left to tell. Let me take a moment to discuss something that often gets lost in the grand strategic picture of the Tyrannic Wars, the Octarius War. This was the conflict that Inquisitor Kryptman deliberately engineered by redirecting a tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan into the Orc Empire of Octarius. And it deserves special attention because of what it reveals about both the hive mind's adaptability and the unintended consequences of trying to manipulate a force of nature. The logic behind Kryptman's plan was sound on paper. The Orc Empire of Octarius was one of the largest concentrations of greenskins in the galaxy, a vast sprawl of worlds teeming with orc life. By introducing Tyranid organisms into this ecosystem, Kryptman hoped to force two of the Imperium's greatest enemies to destroy each other, buying time and resources for the defense against Leviathan elsewhere. It was a bold gamble, and it worked initially. The Tyranids and the Orcs fell upon each other with savage enthusiasm. The greenskins thrilled to have such worthy opponents, and the Tyranids delighted, if delight is even a concept that applies to them, to have found such a rich source of biomass. But the problem with Kryptman's plan was that both Orcs and Tyranids grow stronger through conflict. Orcs are biological organisms that increase in size, strength, and aggression the more they fight. A peaceful orc is a small orc. An orc that has been fighting non-stop for years is a massive, scarred, battle-hardened killing machine. And the Orc Empire of Octarius provided the Orcs with the fight of their lives. The greenskins grew larger and more dangerous than any seen outside the most extreme war zones, their war bosses swelling to enormous proportions as the constant warfare triggered their biological growth imperative. The Tyranids, meanwhile, were doing what Tyranids always do. They were adapting. Every orc they consumed provided genetic material that the Norn Queens incorporated into new bioforms. The Tyranids that emerged from the Octarius cauldron were harder, tougher, more aggressive than their predecessors. They had learned to fight orcs, which is no small feat. The orc way of war is chaotic and unpredictable, driven by individual enthusiasm rather than strategic coordination. Learning to counter that unpredictability required a kind of flexibility that the Tyranids had not previously needed, and they rose to the challenge with their characteristic adaptive brilliance. The result was an arms race of biological escalation that spiraled far beyond what Kryptman had intended. Instead of two enemies grinding each other down into mutual annihilation, the Octarius War produced two enemies that were both significantly more dangerous than they had been before the conflict began. The orcs that survived were the strongest, most warlike specimens of their species. The Tyranids that emerged were adapted to fight the most dangerous opponents the galaxy had to offer, and both forces were now poised to turn their enhanced capabilities against whatever they encountered next. or Cryptman was excommunicated from the Inquisition for his gambit, not because his strategy was irrational, but because the consequences of its failure were so catastrophic that the risk was deemed unacceptable. But his story illustrates a broader truth about dealing with the Tyranids. You cannot manipulate them. You cannot redirect them or trick them or use them as weapons against your other enemies without consequences. The hive mind learns from everything it encounters, and every attempt to exploit it only makes it stronger in the long run. The only way to survive the Tyranids is to fight them, and even that only works for so long. The Octarius War also demonstrated something else. The hive mind is patient, but it is not passive. When the Tyranids in the Octarius system began to gain the upper hand, the hive mind did not simply press its advantage and consume the remaining orcs. Instead, it appeared to be deliberately maintaining the conflict, allowing it to continue as a kind of biological laboratory in which new and more effective bioforms could be tested and refined. The Octarius system became a crucible of accelerated evolution, a proving ground where the hive mind could experiment with new strategies and organisms in real-time combat conditions without risking the strategic assets of the main fleet. This is the behavior of an intelligence that is thinking ahead, not just about the next battle, but about battles that have not yet been fought against enemies that have not yet been encountered. The hive mind is using the Octarius War as a training exercise, producing warriors optimized for the most extreme combat conditions the galaxy has to offer. And when those warriors are eventually unleashed on the rest of the galaxy, they will be hardened by experience that no other military in the Imperium has had to face. There is another dimension to the Tyranid threat that we need to discuss before we can fully appreciate the scope of what the hive mind might be planning. The sheer number of Tyranid organisms in existence is genuinely incomprehensible. Not just large, not just enormous, but so vast that the human mind simply cannot process the figure in any meaningful way. Consider that a single hive fleet can contain billions of individual organisms, from the smallest ripper to the most massive hive ship. Consider that multiple hive fleets have been identified within the galaxy, each one a separate tendril of the greater whole. Consider that these fleets are merely the leading edge of something far larger, a main body of Tyranid biomass that is still traveling through the intergalactic void, still approaching, still not yet committed to the invasion. Some Imperial scholars have attempted to estimate the total number of Tyranid organisms in existence, and have arrived at figures so large that they are literally meaningless, numbers that would take centuries to write out in standard notation, and that exceed the total number of atoms in most stellar systems. Individual hive fleet incursions have been observed to blot out the light of stars as they pass through a system. Not metaphorically, but the biomass of a major hive fleet is dense enough and extensive enough to physically block starlight when viewed from certain angles. Imagine looking up at the night sky and seeing the familiar patterns of constellations disappear, one star at a time, as an approaching hive fleet passes between your world and the distant suns. That slow, steady darkening of the sky is one of the most common descriptions in survivor accounts from worlds that have endured Tyranid invasions, assuming any survivors exist to give accounts at all. The combined Tyranid biomass that has entered the galaxy so far, across all 4 tyrannic wars and every splinter fleet and tendril in between, is estimated to represent only a fraction of the total Tyranid species. Estimates vary wildly, from a generous 10% to a horrifying 1% or less. As if the lower estimates are correct, then what the galaxy has faced so far is, quite literally, the tip of the iceberg. The main body of the swarm, still travelling through the void, still drawn onward by the beacon of the Astronomicon and perhaps by whatever hive fleet Tiamat is building on Zeophoria, dwarfs everything the galaxy has yet encountered by orders of magnitude. This is the existential mathematics of the Tyranid threat. The galaxy's defenders have fought 4 major wars against the Tyranids and have, at best, fought them to a draw. They have not defeated the Tyranids. They have not even significantly reduced the Tyranid threat. They have merely survived the opening probes of an invasion force that has not yet fully arrived. And every year, every decade, every century that passes, more of the main body draws closer. And the resources available to the defenders grow thinner, and the genestealer cults spread wider, and the hive mind learns more about how to kill everything in its path. The mathematics are not kind to the defenders. The Tyranids do not tire. They do not suffer from logistical failures or morale collapses or political infighting. They do not need to train new recruits or manufacture new weapons or maintain supply lines across thousands of light years. They carry their factories with them in the form of Norn queens. They produce their ammunition from the biomass of the worlds they consume. They replace their losses by eating their dead and reconstituting the material into fresh organisms. Every resource the Tyranids expend in battle can be recovered by consuming the battlefield afterward. For the defenders of the galaxy, every soldier lost is gone forever. For the Tyranids, every organism lost is merely temporarily out of circulation. This is what they are preparing for. Not a single decisive battle, not a dramatic final confrontation, but a war of attrition on a galactic scale. A slow, patient, methodical campaign of consumption that will grind down the galaxy's defenses through sheer mathematical inevitability. The Tyranids do not need to be faster or stronger or smarter than their opponents. They just need to be more numerous and more patient. And they are both, by margins so enormous that comparison becomes absurd. But even this grim assessment may understate the true scope of the threat. Because the hive mind is not just waging a war of attrition. It is evolving. It is getting better. Every defeat it suffers teaches it something new. Every victory it achieves adds to its capabilities. The Tyranids that invaded the galaxy in 745 of the 41st Millennium were dangerous. The Tyranids that are attacking the Segmentum Pacificus in the 42nd Millennium are measurably more dangerous, fielding bioforms that did not exist a few centuries ago and employing tactics that were developed specifically to counter Imperial defenses that did not exist when Behemoth first struck Macragge. The rate of Tyranid evolution is accelerating. The interval between the First and Second Tyrannic Wars was roughly 2.5 centuries. Between the Second and Third, barely a few years. The Fourth Tyrannic War followed hard on the heels of the Third, with the hive mind striking the galactic west almost immediately after the resolution of the conflict at Baal. Yet the hive mind is testing the galaxy faster and faster, as if something is driving it to accelerate its timetable. Whether that something is the approaching main body of the swarm, the completion of the Tiamat structure, some external pressure we cannot yet perceive, or simply the hive mind's own assessment that the galaxy is ripe for full-scale invasion, the result is the same. The pace is quickening, the noose is tightening, and the clock is running out for the defenders of the Milky Way. So where does all of this leave us? What can we say with confidence about what the Tyranids are preparing for? We know that the hive mind is an intelligence of almost incomprehensible power, capable of coordinating trillions of organisms across galactic distances with the precision of a single thought. We know that it has been consuming galaxies for an unknown but potentially enormous span of cosmic time. We know that it is approaching the Milky Way from multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting a scale of presence in the intergalactic void that far exceeds what has been observed within the galaxy. We know that it has invested thousands of years in infiltrating and softening target worlds through genestealer cults. We know that it has built, or is building, a massive psychic structure on Zeophoria, whose purpose remains unknown, but clearly involves the amplification and projection of psychic energy on a scale previously unrecorded. We know that it has spawned a specialized hive fleet to combat chaos, suggesting a strategic awareness that encompasses not just military threats, but the fundamental metaphysical structure of the galaxy. And we know that it is accelerating its invasions, striking harder and faster and closer to the heart of the galaxy with each successive wave. What we do not know, and may never know, is why. Is the hive mind driven purely by hunger, an unfathomably vast appetite that will consume the galaxy simply because the galaxy is there? Is it building towards something, a threshold of power or complexity that will transform the swarm into something new and terrible? Is it running from something that threatens even the great devourer, consuming galaxies in its path to fuel its flight? Or is it something else entirely, something so alien and so far beyond human frames of reference that we lack the conceptual vocabulary even to describe its purpose? The answer may be all of these things, or none of them. The hive mind is alien in the truest sense of the word, a consciousness so fundamentally different from anything produced by the galaxy's native civilizations that interpreting its actions through human lenses may be inherently futile. We project our own motivations onto it, because that is what sentient beings do. We see ourselves in everything we encounter, even in things that have nothing in common with us. The Tyranids may have a purpose that makes perfect sense within the framework of their own vast and ancient intelligence, but which is so far removed from human experience that it would be literally incomprehensible to us, even if we could perceive it clearly. What we can say with certainty is this: the Tyranids are preparing. They are methodical. They are patient. They are getting stronger, and they are not finished. Whatever the endgame turns out to be, it has not yet arrived. The 4 tyrannic wars, the billions of lives lost, the dozens of worlds consumed, all of it has been prologue. The first chapters of a story that the hive mind is writing in biomass and extinction across the face of the galaxy. And the next chapter is coming. The tendrils are reaching deeper. The cults are spreading wider. The shadow is growing darker. And somewhere in the void between galaxies, the main body of the swarm is drawing closer, guided by the beacon of the Astronomicon and the pulse of whatever hive fleet Tiamat is building on its distant jungle world. The Tyranids are preparing for something, and when that something arrives, the galaxy will learn whether all its wars and all its sacrifices and all its desperate, blood-soaked defiance was enough to matter, or whether it was all just the appetizer for the main course of a meal that was planned before the first human being ever drew breath. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but war implies 2 sides that can fight, 2 forces that can contend, 2 wills that can clash, and 1 that can prevail. What the Tyranids offer is something different, something worse. Not war, but consumption. Not conflict, but digestion. Not an enemy to be defeated, but a process to be survived. If survival is even possible when the entire galaxy is on the menu. That is the true horror of the great devourer. Not its claws, or its teeth, or its numberless swarms, but its inevitability. The patient, relentless, unstoppable advance of something that has eaten galaxies and will eat more. That has outlasted civilizations that were ancient when the Milky Way was young, and that will still be hungry when the last star burns out and the universe grows cold and dark. The Tyranids are preparing. The question is not whether we can stop them. The question is whether stopping them is even a concept that applies to something this vast, this old, and this fundamentally alien to everything we know. And that question, like the Tyranids themselves, may not have an answer that we can understand. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep exploration of one of the most terrifying and fascinating factions in all of Warhammer 40K. If you made it this far, you are a true champion of the lore, and I appreciate every moment you have spent here with me. Please hit that like button if you enjoyed this one. And subscribe to Caillou on 40,000 if you have not already. We have so much more to explore in the grim darkness of the far future, and I would love to have you along for the ride. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think the Tyranids are truly preparing for? What do you think the endgame of the Great Devourer will turn out to be? I read every comment, and I love hearing your theories and perspectives. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay curious, stay brave, and remember, the stars are beautiful, but they are not as empty as they seem. Something is out there, watching, waiting, and very, very hungry. See you in the next one.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.